You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time now for the show that brings you all sides of the news that really matters. In the politically independent corner, I am radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There we go, trying to get weirdly dramatic with that intro. Getting into the headlines now, then it's Jamarl's monologue, and at 7:15 we're taking calls. But first, we've got the news. The Democrat-controlled House of Representatives vote to cut the Pentagon's budget by 10% failed overnight with a 93 to 324 vote. This is the first time in decades that Congress has considered a, quote, substantial, end quote, cut to a bloated Pentagon budget. We'll see what comes next. That's it's obviously shameful that failed as dramatically as it did, let alone failed at all. But we'll see where that goes. That's heartening at the very least that we're seeing some of those moves come out now. In our second story, the U.S. has reported over 1,000 deaths per day for the first time since May. Yesterday afternoon, in his first solo press room briefing on the coronavirus in months, President Trump warned that it, quote, will get worse. We actually have a clip of him. It's going to go over that statement a little bit before, a little bit after. But first, let's play that clip.
The China virus is a vicious and dangerous illness, but we've learned a great deal about it and who it targets. We are in the process of developing a strategy that's going to be very, very powerful. We've developed them as we go along. Some areas of our country are doing very well. Others are doing less well. It will probably, unfortunately, get worse before it gets better. Something I don't like saying about things, but that's the way it is. It's what we have. You look over the world, it's all over the world.
There's a lot to talk about in that clip, but let's talk about that more later. I just sort of wanted to get that up front in people's minds in case they hadn't heard that whole thing. Also in coronavirus news, on Sunday, the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, said he may re-implement a stay-at-home order over the next week or two. That is, again, behind New York City. As far as I can tell, it's the second largest city having to deal with this new influx of infections, basically. So for them to re-implement a lockdown, that would be a big move nationally in terms of what's being done. In our next story, McConnell says the next COVID bill passed by Congress will include more direct payments to individuals and families. The GOP wants to spend about $1 trillion. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said Monday that the goal was to keep the spending bill around $1 trillion, but by Tuesday he had abandoned that. Democrats have proposed extending $600 a week. Would rather cut those extra benefits to $200 a week. So about $400 a week less than what the Democrats are pushing for. A brief note here, I don't have this written up in notes, but Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin are sort of the two White House delegates handling this. And it seems like of the two, Steve Mnuchin is taking the lead, and he's more conciliatory to the Democrats. Mark Meadows is a bit more of a staunch Republican, long-term Republican. Steve Mnuchin, a recent Republican, let's just put it that way. And he seems to be the one sort of making inroads with Democrat leaders on this bill and bills like this one. In our next story, 15 people were wounded Tuesday evening outside a funeral in Chicago, with victims ranging from 21 to 65 years old, after inhabitants of a car drove in and started shooting, and attendees of the funeral began shooting back. That led to this wave of violence. The funeral was mourning a victim of gun violence. Over on Twitter, they banned 7,000 QAnon accounts. It limits 150,000 others as part of a broad crackdown. A Twitter spokesperson said that while the targeted enforcement fell under Twitter's existing platform manipulation rules, the classification of QAnon material and behavior as coordinated harmful activity was a new designation. Last year, the FBI designated QAnon as a potential domestic terrorist threat. The FBI's report on QAnon's ties to the dangerous real-world activities led in part to Twitter's decision a spokesperson said. In our next story, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Denmark today, meeting with the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, who last August called Trump's proposal to buy Greenland, quote, absurd, end quote. Pompeo is suspected to discuss the coronavirus and China while there, and in addition to meeting with Prime Minister Frederiksen, will also be meeting with the Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs, along with the ministers of Greenland and the Faroe Islands. The fact that he'll be meeting with the ministers of Greenland and the Faroe Islands signals not only Pompeo and the United States' interest in the Arctic as a priority here, it also signals the fact that Denmark is taking those two territories seriously. They're bringing them to the table, sort of have their own say in that conversation. The United States has ordered the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston in a move the Chinese Foreign Ministry today called, quote, outrageous and unjustified, end quote. State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortega said the U.S. was acting to, quote, protect American intellectual property and Americans' private information, end quote. This follows an announcement by the Justice Department on Tuesday of an indictment charging 2 Chinese nationals, both living in China, with hacking governments, dissidents, human rights activists, and private companies, including those engaged in COVID-19 vaccine research. China currently has its embassy in Washington and, in addition to Houston, has consulates in New York, LA, San Francisco, and Chicago. An article in China's Global Times, an outlet that's close to the ruling Communist Party, suggested that China could order the closure of the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong in response to the State Department's latest decision here. In our next story, a hostage standoff aboard a bus in Ukraine ended yesterday shortly after Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky promoted the animal rights film Earthlings on social media at the request of the hostage taker, who is a 44-year-old convicted criminal who liked to take care of stray dogs. We might talk about that later. That's just an interesting story. I was watching that yesterday, didn't know what was going on, then checked in later, and yep, apparently they were an animal rights person who was doing this thing. Anyway, our next story here. Russia is reporting they have developed a working COVID-19 vaccine and will begin mass production of it next month with the goal of inoculating its population in the autumn. The chief executive of the Russian Direct Investment Fund has said that 50 million Russians, or a third of the Russian population about, could be vaccinated, quote, in the near future, end quote. In my last story today, Trump was asked at his press conference about Ghislaine Maxwell, the fixer to apex pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Trump quickly dodged the question, saying he wished her well. Trump and Bill Clinton's relationship with Epstein and Maxwell is well established in the photographic record, and by their own statements even, though neither of the men have been willing to divulge details of the relationship. You're all caught up. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamarl, now that I've gone slightly too long on the headlines here in terms of the time, what's your top priority for today? What are you talking about?
No, you're fine. Look, my top priority for today is basically the bickering back and forth between Congress. Oftentimes, in doing this job, either doing the radio show or my own show, you have to pretty much give of yourself. All of your experiences, all of the things that make you you, and to give you that particular point of view of the world, gets kind of appropriated into trying to explain how you view a particular story. Because at the end of the day, what you're giving is how I view this. And here's the information backing up how I view this. And sometimes that information entails you. In doing so, I oftentimes have to talk about stuff that is either dark, just from my own past, or for that matter, that may be considered to be sad. If you're talking about hospitalizations or surgeries and those type of things, dealing with a kid with some kind of debilitating medical illness. I never bring that up in the sense of sadness. I only bring that stuff up in the sense of context, even though I do understand that people with different sets of experiences may find it, let's say, not necessarily the best of situations. Look, I get that. And so I understand sometimes this kind of emotive thing that people say, oh, I feel bad or I feel sorry for this. Those people did nothing to me. And in real terms, any experience that I know, whether dark, whether sad, whether somewhere in between, basically allowed me to be who I am. I can't extricate who I am from whatever that bad experience was. It brings context and it brings an understanding of the world in a way that you can't necessarily get it outside of that experience. Part and parcel to that has to do with growing up with this notion of not having access to the things that you need, or a real understanding of what it means to be poor and to be broke. And it's something that nearly half of the country understands, which is appalling considering it's the richest country ever. The richest country on the planet. The wealth of this nation is unparalleled. Jeff Bezos is considering potentially being a trillionaire. Put that in perspective. You have all of these companies that have gone bust, especially service industry companies, up in smoke. Bezos, however, gets off on that because Amazon gets that much more business when people can't go out and shop into other actual stores, meaning he gets to profit off of the misery and destruction of our economy. The morality of it doesn't factor into our economy. The profits do. Now, when I hear Congress complaining and bickering about what they want for a bill. Now, Democrats put out a $3 trillion bill of their priorities, none of which include Medicare for all or elimination of student debt. And to be fair, you can make a case that that is less problematic right now at this moment. I would say no, Medicare for all is more pertinent now at this moment than anything else, even though it's not included in the bill. And you would think, considering these are Democrats, and they continuously tell us that we're trying to move forward to universal health. We'll get there in 1,000 years, but we're going to get there. Considering that Medicare for all has the top priority of anything else, meaning in regards to what the public wants, and it's not in the bill. And get you this notion of the undermining of priorities that should be set forward if indeed you're talking about the party that's supposed to represent the left. This is not saying that it's the greatest thing on the planet. It's saying that from the standpoint of the left, this is the policy with 88% support. That's not included in the Democrats' bill. Republicans are debating on a $1 trillion bill. Now, understand what this means. We're talking about human beings with life and limb who have lost their jobs, many of which through no fault of their own, entirely because of virus, something that's a real thing just so happened to hit. It would be like a hurricane, or for that matter, an asteroid hitting. It's as natural can be. The catch is, when that Congress stimulus expires on July, you're going to have people who lose access to their homes and get thrown out into the streets into the millions. And you're going to have people who are making $600 more, which to anybody that is working, that's making somewhat of a decent living, realizes that that's not a huge amount, even though that was enough to keep them on some level of subsistence. That's going away. To put this in perspective, when that program expires, in Arkansas, this means that people could go from receiving $681 a week to $81 a week. In Florida and Tennessee, the highest paid workers will receive a maximum of $275 compared to $875 they were getting. The Times reported. You still have people like Ted Cruz and people like Rand Paul basically saying, no, these people need to get back to work. We should not be giving these poor people an extra $600 in order to keep the economy afloat. How depraved. In fact, the entire argument of this is depraved. You realize that the reason this was put to the edge like this was to use the pain and desperation of the population itself as political fodder to force one side or the other to acquiesce to demands. Meaning that the Democrats are going to say, oh, the Republicans, how heartless they are, and not appropriating our bill. The Republicans are going to say how heartless the Democrats are, that they're not willing to accept this plan to help all of these people. And they will run videos attacking one another using the desperation and pain of Americans in this kind of trolley problem, or this kind of problem of who's willing to go as far as they can before they go off the cliff. They are even anticipating that the debates for this is going to go all the way out to October. Understand what that means. We're, August, September? 2 months of desperation as what they're using in order to squeeze out a deal. Purely politics, without any full understanding, reality, or even care about the consequences to the American public, considering that all of them are rich. All of these people are unattached to all of the stuff that's going on in real terms. So this is more of an intellectual squeezing. How much political fodder can we make out of this? When real people are going to be hurt by these political games. The entire point that this was put here at the end like this was for that specific effect. This is your Congress. This is how much they care about the American public, meaning not at all. This is all political fodder for them. Shane, we can talk about this a little bit more, but all of this kind of bespeaks of a broken and corrupt political system that in no way deals with the real material interests of the public. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
Tune in every Wednesday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou for a regular segment called Beyond Nuclear, where Brian and John discuss nuclear issues, including weapons, energy, waste, and the future of nuclear technology in the United States, with Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Listen on Wednesdays right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. Welcome back to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. If you just so happen to be in the Washington, D.C. area, you can listen to us there on the radio. We're on at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If, on the other hand, you're in the Kansas City area, you can listen to us there on the radio, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, also 1140 AM. If, on the converse side of things, you're online, like practically everybody is these days, you can listen to us on Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Music. We're over on YouTube, live, with video. Do a search for Jamarl Thomas. You'll see his smiling face and my smiling but still face there on his live channel. Over on Fault Lines Radio, if you do a search for Fault Lines Radio, you'll see the live channel with a new icon that has slightly scary animated versions of Jamarl and I. Please, go check it out. My words
I have
nothing.
to see that. Really?
Can you see that? Yeah, go check it out.
I haven't seen that yet. Oh yeah,
that's not. Yeah, that was yesterday, and I kind of did a double take the first time I saw it, and then a triple take, and at that point I had whiplash and was thankful that I could just look away from that scary image. No, I'm just kidding. I kind of like it too. But anyway, you can also find us over on Twitter, on Periscope. We're live there right now by audio primarily. There's a still image on Periscope. Just go to twitter.com/faultlinesradio. You'll find us. Please like, share. Oh, and you know what? Jamarl, this is our chance to have a brief sort of wrap-up on-show meeting. We should be doing that thing today where we're taking quick notes on, like, good segments to grab. You know what I mean? That thing we talked about yesterday?
Yes, the cut the videos. Yeah.
Exactly.
I was telling you, I pay Miss Thomas for that, right? like I pay my wife $15 an hour. I don't. It might not be that much because there's a wife figure in there that I can pay her less.
Minimum wage, man.
But whatever I pay her, it's for that. To cut some of the videos because sometimes they're really good segments. And so we're gonna start doing that a little bit more so. Than I think what we've been typically doing.
We should totally do that. No, we should totally do that. I just feel the need to call you up for your patriarchy, Jamarl. You know, there you are. I'm just giving you crap. I mean, I'm just giving you crap.
It's funny. I was like, I feel like I got to pay you $25 or $15 an hour. The problem is the amount of work is always, there are like 2 months, there were no clips to cut. It's like, but you're still getting paid. So, it balances out.
I hear you. No, I hear you. No,
that's where I'm staying. It balances out.
So here's the thing. We are taking calls this segment. Anybody who wants to call in can. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. I wanted to, and we have Tarif on the line. I wanted to actually respond briefly, sort of obliquely, to your monologue and to the points you were making there. I don't think we've gotten into this conversation yet, but this might be an interesting one to come back to. Draw out some of the themes in it and come back to those themes or something. I have this longstanding vilification. I've vilified mass politics for a little while there, and I still stand by a lot of that stuff, but I'm willing to admit that I might be wrong. But here's the basic idea. And we've talked about some of this stuff before. Democracy should be local. Democracy is best when it's local. Democracy is best when it's relatively small scale, because then you get a chance for the people who are making the decisions, like directly the citizens, the people, to have this close sort of feedback loop with the problems they're trying to solve, instead of trying to solve these national problems about which they know next to nothing. And, most of those decisions are sort of reserved for behind rooms deals by representatives. You know what I mean? And so democracy, like functional democracy, where people are actively engaged in solving things, that should happen on the local scale. And a part of that process, ideally, is you move more of the powers back from the federal government to the local scale. You do this, federal devolution thing where you devolve the responsibilities and powers of the federal government back to the states or back to local municipalities and cities, that kind of thing. Now, we sort of talked about that stuff before, and I've been vaguely pushing it, but here's one of the main reasons why, and this is a response to a bunch of the stuff you were saying. A lot of the problems I see in our culture are the result of the fact that we're having to engage in mass politics. The fact that we have masses of people within which you can't distinguish any individual perspective or opinion. It's this sort of representative constituent mass that's supposed to represent public opinion. And what happens, that's a necessity of having to engage in mass electoral politics. So you have parties. What happens with that, though, is not only do the parties get ossified, you get each party has its sort of own increasingly incoherent set of beliefs as they drift further and further from whatever, philosophy they were ostensibly supposed to be founded on. You get that happening. And then what you get are these larger culture wars where, like, you have politicians levying the masses against the other masses, levying the constituents of their party against the constituents of the other party, in what turns into like this increasingly metastasized social strife thing, where just society as a whole is arguing with itself and bickering. And what they're bickering over increasingly are these abstract ideas that have nothing to do with their local physical reality, things they don't know that much or frankly even care that much about. It's just that they've sort of been made to care by mass media. And it's like this continuum of mass media entities founded in the early 20th century. You've got to remember that, radio, TV, the development of these mass media entities, as well as mass politics and the sort of mass culture phenomena that we've seen in the last century with TV and the rise of, like, as far as I can tell, the rise of this relatively homogenous pop culture. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff to say there, but I think it's kind of all of a piece, and I really don't like it. That's my take. What's yours, Jamarl?
So I would say this. I don't think there's a local way of solving climate change. Meaning, like, I don't think individual states, or even in the United States, who make up 5% of the population itself, can come together and figure out a way to solve climate change on its own. I just don't believe it. And those problems get that much more magnified when you're talking about states. If states weren't part of the United States, those states would have went to war already. Just in general. Why wouldn't they? Anytime you have this kind of international conflict, even if you have a domestic strife issue or you're pushing some kind of domestic politics, I guarantee you at some point, one of the states that hadn't cobbled together already would have already been at war with one another over something, be it resources, supplies, munitions, whatever. You would have one state that would have bulked up in its defensiveness, let's say maybe the right-wing states. Those right-wing states, when they bulked up in their defensiveness, would have compelled other states to also do the same, meaning you would have ended up with competition and competing states because of these capitalistic gains, and for that matter, things that they might have needed. It's not necessarily a horrible thing to come together as a collective and come together as a larger collective when you realize the collective interest is at stake. I don't necessarily buy that is in and of itself the problem that we're confronted with. Those states could have also have ossified communities. I mean, if you're looking at countries and talking about countries abroad, those countries are about the size of states. And what we see is just basically competition to the point where the European Union thought, hey, we need to form to be something more like the United States because otherwise we keep bringing and dragging ourselves into war. I just don't buy the argument that all of the problems or many of the problems deal with the devolution of powers. Even though I can understand why a smaller organization of power would want that power. I can even understand why local politics matters greatly to the local thing. And the problem becomes, though, that Medicare for All can't necessarily be initiated locally because states don't control their own currency. Now, you can go and say, well, let states have the control of their own currency, but that gets old into state rights stuff. I don't entirely buy that. I think these are cultural issues. I agree with that part. I even agree that first principle stuff, basically on what you believe and what, ethical behavior, moral behavior, being behavior that allows a collective or cohesive way of organization where it doesn't necessarily trespass on other things that people want to do. But I think it just goes beyond the cultural or the political devolution stuff. I agree with you that in a large sense, that the issues that pertain to California are going to be the issues that may pertain to, let's say, Massachusetts. Agreed. Two completely different places on two different sides of the globe. But I don't necessarily think that those things can't be a mean as some kind of political device. And I do think states, in and of themselves, that the fact they have states are a way of trying to deal with that by having local politics and then having those local politics go to higher thing. But I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. That the issue primarily, or maybe not primarily. Primarily is putting words in your mouth. But the issue boils down to this notion of no, you need to have local governments, and those local governments need to have more autonomy and more authority. I don't believe it. I think that gets you into more wars, to be honest. Even though I agree that there's a difference in what each of those things may want. I do think at some point bringing those things together is a positive realization. Otherwise, you just have chaos. So tell me, what do you think of that? Is any of that wrong from your perspective?
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff I would disagree with there, but we should get to calls. One
Go for
quick
it.
note before we get to get to Tarif. A lot of my thinking here is going to be coming from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. So that's just sort of my, and I like to put this stuff out front, my biases. That's kind of my bias in this direction. So if you read that book, if you develop like really mortal criticisms of that book, you'll probably have them from my opinion too. Anyway, we can come back to this conversation at some other point. We'll be taking calls for just another minute here if anybody else wants to call in these last couple seconds. Right now, though, we have Tarif from New Orleans. Tarif, you are on the line. What's going on, Tarif?
How y'all doing? Good morning, gentlemen. When I was brought up about the slavery thing yesterday, dealing with how deep it was, I got the information from the LaRouche movement. This man named Anton Shakin and Webster Tarpley. I think they put that together. It's not in the book form. It's throughout the archives at the LaRouche EIR organization, right? It deals with Mexico, Central and South America, how the elites that was part of the slavery thing wanted to connect the South to Mexico and to have produce cheap goods like cotton and sugarcane and things like that. So it is deeper than what I said yesterday. So his name is Anton Shakin and Webster Tarpley. They work together on a book, and also I put some links to Treason in America, the George Bush, the unauthorized biography in the American Prometheus book to y'all link for today underneath y'all tweet. That's all I want to say.
Thank you for that, Tarif. I appreciate the links there. Yeah, the LaRouche community is kind of interesting. I've got to admit, reading through some other stuff, looking through some other stuff, I've learned a bit, but they also have these sort of vast, sprawling theories of how the world works that are a little bit incoherent to me, just trying to get into them. But I mean, obviously smart people. I hear they get some things wrong, but I honestly haven't looked into them too deeply. But appreciate the recommendation there.
One way or the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I did look for people who are hearing that name. Just here's how you spell the name that he was saying. He was saying the name Anton Shakin. I didn't know how to spell that. Just looked it up. Anton, Anton, pardon me, Anton, and then Shakin. The last part's actually where it gets hard. Chaitkin, Shakin. Anyway, no real support. Don't know anything about the dude, but I had a little bit of a mishap trying to search for it while I was talking about it. So that's how you actually spell that name. You know what though? Here's what I think we should do. Any closing comments, Jamarl, or do you want to close out so we can go to Dr. Kogan?
No, I want you to. You said there are plenty of things that you're going to disagree with. I want to hear the disagreements. Go for it.
All right.
You have 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes.
I'll go to Tocqueville for a second. So Tocqueville came to America. He was one of two people from France coming to America. The other of whom wrote this book, whose name I'm forgetting right now, but it was about slavery. And that book wasn't as widely known, although I hear it should be. Democracy in America, the book Tocqueville wrote, got pretty popular there for a while, specifically on the continent, and then it kind of came back to popularity in the States. And I'm not going to try to you know what? I have to. I'll dramatically simplify his argument here. I don't like doing that kind of thing. But as far as I can tell, he says that Americans have a sort of spirit, a way of operating politically that he is not used to seeing, where we get together on the small level and in our kind of own inefficient little parochial way, we solve problems that other countries would rely on local governments or larger, the federal authority to solve. We do that on this local scale. And what he says is that's what sort of makes us unique and uniquely powerful as a nation, is that because people are engaged on the local level in a sort of unprecedented way, we have this ace in our sleeve culturally. What he predicted was that as we relied on the federal government to solve our problems, as we sort of gave that authority up passively and in some sense efficiently, because again, the federal government can do a lot of this stuff more efficiently than local governments can. As you do that, you lose that spirit. You lose and this is where I seriously start to paraphrase him, you lose real democracy. You lose any actual authentic engagement. Instead, what you get is sort of this cultural war that I think we're seeing the real fruits of now. You just see this high-level, abstract, back and forth disagreement over nothing that people don't really know anything about. It takes too long to look into these things, so we're completely detached from it. There is no democracy really on that high level. It's all just a puppet show and appearances. And I can't help but agree with that, man. I feel like we need to get that culture, that local democratic, invigorative spirit back. You know what I mean? That's my... Anyway, I've gone over my 2-minute mark, I think. I'm going to close it out here. We can come back to this conversation later. Thank you for the opportunity to finish up, Jamarl. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're taking a guest this segment. We're taking calls last segment, did headlines the segment before. This segment and the next segment, we're speaking with Dr. Mawell Kogan. Dr. Mawell Kogan is the medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine. He's also associate professor of medicine at George Washington University. And most importantly, I think he's the founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. Dr. Kogan, how are you doing this morning?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty well.
Good to hear. Yeah, thank you for joining us. Real quick, a few places we could start off. I'm actually going to check in at the facility where you're working, to the extent that you can tell us. How have you seen the coronavirus? How have things been going from your end, from your perspective? What have you been hearing locally to the extent that you can reveal this stuff, or to the extent that you know about it? What's been going on from your perspective?
Well, I think the hospital is doing reasonably well. Chicago University Hospital. We have not seen any spikes. The counts of the admissions to the hospital and current census have been steady and pretty low, which is a good news for us. We had some interesting administrative issues. For example, one of our staffers was exposed to someone positive, so we had to tackle to decide, are we closing the clinic? Are we rescheduling some of the patients if we can't get a replacement quickly? So, kind of a more of a logistics. But, I would say locally here, the news are mostly positive from that perspective. Are we prepared to hold the fort if the surge happens? We'll see. We're trying.
And what would you say, this is sort of a representative question, but what would you say to somebody who hears what you just said and was kind of cynical about the idea that coronavirus is as big of a deal as doctors and medical officials are making it out to be? And now you're saying you're not really seeing it. What would you say to that person who's kind of like, well,
Well, yeah, it's not that we're not seeing it. We're seeing it. The disease is devastating and very unique and severe. I don't know if I told your listeners before, one specific case stands out to me since, I'm a geriatrician. When I'm in a hospital, I do consults on older population, and we've seen a case where we had a person coming in with very mild cognitive impairment, and she was in the hospital for weeks and weeks and weeks. And when she was discharged to hospice with basically a terminal Alzheimer-like disease. So this is one scary complication when a severe neurologic illness that ends up in advanced dementia-like state, and we don't even know why that happens. So, and if you carefully look at some of these complications, this is only one. Pretty much every organ can be impacted, and the more frail person going into disease, the more likely they're going to come out of it with all kinds of complications and if person to survive. So I think the idea that somehow, this is all hoax from my perspective, seeing this firsthand is nonsense. The disease we've never seen, and we still have not learned how to deal with it. Although on the bright side, we're clearly seeing a gradual improvement in hospital, what we call an inpatient mortality, and it's due to the fact that the treatments are improving. And I can talk about treatments if you think listeners would be interested. But we clearly see certain new advances, and they not necessarily cure, but they're improvement in supportive care, which ends up leading to improvement in mortality.
Let me ask you this. You said unique. So what is so unique about the virus? Because I've noticed this is not like a flu. It seems that the way people are affected kind of has a really broad scale in comparison to something like just basic respiratory illnesses. So what do you mean when you say unique? What is the thing that is unique about the way this virus propagates in the system?
I'm so glad you brought up the flu, because I'm honestly tired on Facebook and answering people saying, oh, it's just another flu. No, it is not just another flu. When people get sick with the flu, even in a severe illness, when they recover, there's almost never any consequences. And if you're young, your mortality is, somewhere around one in less than 1 in 1,000. And this illness, this is right now, if you look at the global percentage of mortality, if you just look at all the cases that we have registered in the world, which is almost 15 million, and how many people died, which is 650 some plus deaths, that's about 4% of mortality. If you compare that to the flu, you can't. This is totally incomparable mortality. Now, some people say, oh, no, it's not 4%. It's 0.4% because you don't count for cases that are asymptomatic, never been diagnosed. Well, okay, fine, but it's exactly the same with flu. So if you say the same true with flu, then the flu mortality is 1 in 10,000 or even less. So you can't compare them. It's not just the mortality, because on top of that, as I said, almost every organ can get hit. Let me give you one concrete example of COVID, which is completely different from flu. In flu, we don't really see a lot of clotting. Clotting is when the vessel gets clogged by the blood forming a clot. And if it occurs in a kind of distant area of not a lot of significance, like you can have a blue toe. The toe, you may lose a toe, but not a big deal. But imagine that happens in the lungs or in the brain, and then you have either a pulmonary embolism, which can kill you within seconds, or a stroke, which can also kill you quickly. So those are the complications that are very unique to COVID, specific this one. It's very frequent. We don't fully understand why this happens. 2 weeks ago, we had a special grand round at GW with a speaker who's a hematologist, specifically describing what's happening with the clotting. It's extremely complex. But as a result, now that we know a little bit about it, or a lot more than we used to, almost all the patients go on the blood thinners in the hospital to try to prevent this from happening. But unfortunately, that's actually not a bulletproof. So a lot of people still get clotting even though they're on anticoagulants, which, again, we don't fully understand why even that happens. Usually the treatment works reasonably well. And the other systemic manifestations are even more confusing, I'd say. So some of them are even less understood, but I think I think it's what everybody thinks, is that there's some kind of a global inflammatory response. So inflammation systemically can impact any organ, and it happens on an individual basis, and the consequences are according to that organ's weakness.
Interesting. That's very interesting. When we get into this conversation of kids, is the same thing true? We've been pushing this, or people have been pushing this narrative that, oh, kids get sick, it's not that big of a deal. Now, I don't necessarily think that's true. Like you say, there's all sorts of weaknesses that could present that is specific and individual to the kid. But right there, is it safe under these guidelines and under these terms, considering all of these new cases that have been sweeping across the United States, would that make it safe haven to open up schools?
Well, I mean, so that's a great question. I have 10, 11, and 13-year-old, almost 13, and I'll tell you, we're struggling with this at home. I think kids are a lot safer. To say that they're safe, I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely not. There's several diseases that suddenly spiked among pediatric populations. I'll give you one example. It's a very unusual, uncommon disorder called Kawasaki disease, which is an inflammation in the vessels or vasculitis. And that spiked because it's a COVID. So it's related directly to a COVID. So kids get it because it's a COVID causing it. It's the low numbers for all of these conditions, and kids' mortality, thank God, has been extremely low compared to adults. But nonetheless, first of all, schools, it's not just kids, right? I mean, it's adults too. The teachers, support staff, and it's very unclear how do you get them going in a huge class. Standard classes, even if everybody wears masks, is definitely not 6 feet. I mean, the chances of passing of infection is going to be large, most likely. My personal opinion here is we should keep the schools closed. I'm just expressing it, But so then, what do you do in the families where parents are working and, the adult care, daycare is probably going to be also closed for that same reason. And so now what? How are the kids? So we're going to have a lot of logistical problems, a lot of psychological problems if schools get closed. The disruption will be quite significant. The schools somehow will have to make sure that everybody have enough technology and enough internet access to have kids attend school from home. It's not easy, for sure. I understand. I don't know if you guys correct me if I'm wrong. Well, it's all changing day by day. I think yesterday Montgomery County stated that they're going to keep the schools closed. I understand that. I have not seen more. I think it will probably evolve over the next weeks and months. Sure, what happens, and I doubt that. I personally think, unfortunately, schools are going to get closed, and that's what seems like at the present. The leaders of scientific community think, at least in some regions of the country. Of course, it's going to be hugely politically divided.
Dr. Kogan, thank you for this. I've got one more question I'm going to follow up with in just a minute. We'll only have a short time for response. I do, however, have a breaking news story here. Britain and the United States have changed their diplomatic rules. Pardon me, Britain and the UK have changed their diplomatic rules with the United States. This follows the diplomat's wife, who turned out to be a sort of an intelligence official herself, who killed Harry Dunn, the kid in the UK last year. This is related to that. So that's breaking. We'll have more details on that soon. I just wanted to throw that in here soon. We might not have enough time for this question, but here, let's try maybe 30, 45 seconds. We can set this up and then maybe come back to it after the break. I have a question here. We were talking earlier about two things. You brought up the idea of new treatments, where you have some inside knowledge on new treatments. And before that, we started talking about some of the other conditions that can come with this, some of the sequelae, or when you get COVID-19, after you've contracted it, after you've suffered from it, there are these other conditions that sort of follow on. I've heard things from everything from the loss of smell to potentially infertility based on the types of cells that are getting hit hardest by this virus. I'm seeing within the last day or two sores inside of the mouth. So there are these things that for a while there, in my experience, were sort of in the realm of anecdote. I heard a lot of people talking about these things, and I started to see some news stories about them, but I didn't see papers. I didn't see anything authoritative enough where I could say, well, yes, this is something that actually does happen. Again, we're going to go into a break now, but maybe we can come back on that topic. We're joined now by Dr. Mawell Kogan. We'll be back with Dr. Mawell Kogan in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil. John Gaunt. Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're joined for the second segment by Dr. Mikhail Kogan, who's the medical director over at George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine. He's also the founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. We're having a conversation about the coronavirus and its impact, how to treat it, how it's going to go socially, how it affects schools reopening, different questions here. When we went into the break last time, I ended with this sort of open question about the potential complications or side effects or sequelae after contracting COVID-19. Could you give us some info on what you've seen, what you've heard, and what you know about that, Dr. Kogan?
There's not a lot of data. That's very true. Unfortunately, to come up with a correct case series write-up takes quite a lot of time. I've done some of this myself, and I tell you, it's not an easy undertaking. So I think that's part of the issue. We're lagging behind in reports because they take time to correctly position, submit to publication, and get through the peer review. Although I have reviewed a few things. So I reviewed the neurologic complications, a set of over 100 cases of different neurologic manifestations. And, you know, again, you're right, these are all anecdotes. There are cohorts of a few cases here, a few cases there. But remember, when we started talking, we compared this to flu. Well, we never see anything like this with flu. So what does this mean on a global scheme? I think, again, it goes back to inflammatory processes. And I think it also goes back to the fact that it probably is one of those illnesses that triggers any possible weakness in our immune system. So when we are either predisposed to be hyperinflamed and suddenly the inflammation goes amok, the organ that's weak gets hit and we have manifestation, like you mentioned, skin. Skin manifestations are even, I think, probably less common, although they've seen. People have seen different colors in the skin, different ulcers, and it seems like, as you said, it takes a while for the organ that is affected to recover. Why? Not clear, but people have symptoms. I have several patients who have a mild disease, and several of them still, until now, have difficulty breathing when they walk around. Same way, you also mentioned sense of smell. I had one patient whose sense of smell came back. Again, what does that mean in terms of a global effect and global impact? Well, we may be going to see going forward thousands of patients, if not millions, having continuous symptomatology for a long time, and healthcare systems are going to have to deal with this. It's one thing, I don't know if you want me to just bring this up, but I will anyway, since I'm talking. One thing, we don't really appreciate the magnitude of financial impact through the healthcare system. And you probably have discussed, there was several where were reported in the media that patients stuck with over $1 million bills. This is not going to be few patients. There's going to be thousands of patients with those types of bills. And the current reported average of healthcare spending per person who gets sick is somewhere around $70,000. I think it's massively underrepresented. I wouldn't be surprised if we were going to look at the hundreds of thousands per person. Now, multiply that by the fact that we already, have millions of infections. So think of it, if we get 10% of population eventually sick, and out of that, whatever the percentage that actually going to manifest the symptoms, and that's going to be the cost. I mean, we're going to see a jump of possible catastrophic magnitude in the healthcare expenses. So I don't know, and I'm not really seeing that discussed a lot in the media or in any public domains in the government. So I maybe they're still trying to figure it out. The costs, maybe they're trying to say, look, as the treatments get better, costs will go down. I don't think so, because ultimately disease itself is not going to get changed a lot, and there are currently no treatments or no proposed treatments that somehow will arrest the disease very early on. So, like the hydroxychloroquine has failed for sure. Drugs like remdesivir applied at the very late or later stage. And, there are some drugs in the pipeline. Maybe they will work, maybe they will not work. But part of the problem is that the drugs also cost a lot of money. And so if they impact a small proportion of people, making them quickly better, that may or may not have going to improve the healthcare, decrease cost of healthcare.
One of the weirdest things that sometimes, I'm glad you're bringing that up, because these are the practical realities of having to deal with a virus or having to deal with a medical illness. I mean, whether it's COVID or whether it's heart disease, the individual is stuck dealing with and grappling with something on their own. I used to have a boss of mine where he knew of the medical issues that I had to deal with over time. And he would say, hey, your health matters more. Now, the same guy who would say, hey, your health matters more, will fire you if, for reasons of health, you're not coming to work. It's this kind of weird, it's like, yeah, you got to deal with the health issue. And it's like, great. How are we going to pay for it? That's on you. Meaning, it's like, yeah, the COVID-19 is really, really important. We got to deal with it. We got to make sure people are safe. We got to make sure people get treatment. But then when those people ask the very basic question, how do you expect me to pay for this illness, especially when the outcomes of the illness are not necessarily singular. It's not like you're going for pneumonia and it's a very explicit, rigid treatment where you have a clear idea on what the costs are going to be. You've made the point that said, basically, this disease can present in all sorts of ways based on the weaknesses that are inherent to that particular system. Whether that's kidney failure, whether that's heart disease, or whether that's some kind of skill issue, it seems to exacerbate whatever is already there, making the medical situation and the costs that much worse. How are patients paying for this under normal circumstances? Meaning we have, 2-point-something million people in this country infected. And there is a clear skew in regards to how outcomes, meaning for African Americans, I think in the state of Maine, I think it was like blacks make up 2%, where you have like a 20-something% number of people who are infected. Like, these numbers are way off. How are people paying for this up to this point? Or are they is this just kind of a medical bill that goes on to the point of being bankruptcy?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what you just said. That's the last. I mean, I don't think there is a structure. I mean, you would think, right, that with the healthcare for the spending bill that was passed, the first stimulus, and now likely the second one, you would think that they'll put that in, that all the healthcare expenses is going to be on that stimulus. But no. I mean, my understanding currently, whatever the healthcare insurance you have, that's what's going to pay. And, the healthcare insurances, they've never seen anything like this. I mean, they're bombarded now by their patients, their clients, many of them with these huge bills. I mean, the $1 million bill I mentioned, that's not one out of. No, there are many of those. Because think of a very simple logistics here. If you're in a hospital for 4 weeks, the ICU is at least $10,000 per day, usually $20,000 or even $30,000 a day, with the regular floor now at $10,000 a day easy. I mean, just multiply that by number of days in the hospital, and you're already up in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's before any medication, before consultant fees, before all this other fees that a hospital generates. And, the insurance is going to see this, and they're probably going to deny a lot of stuff. They're going to say, well, we never paid for this, and we're not going to. What's going to happen with the people? People are going to see those bills. And, of course, many of them are, forget the 100,000. I mean, most people who are, struck with this are already potentially not working, already don't have an income. They may not even afford a $10,000 bill. So what's going to happen? Well, we don't know. We really don't know how is this going to be getting handled when we're going to start seeing, thousands of those bills. It always delayed a lot because, what happens is the bill gets sent to the insurance does something, they claim, the bill was done incorrectly, or they'll start fighting with the hospital over details of the bill. It's often months back and forth. So we haven't seen this in the media yet at fast, but we will. Just trust me. We can come back to this 4 weeks from now, and I'll tell you, most likely we're going to start seeing more and more of this discussed in the media, because it's going to be more frequent. I hope, that was my hope. I don't know if it'll happen, but it probably makes a lot of sense for the federal government to step in and say, hey, wait a second, can't have this. I mean, this has to be put into the stimulus so that the insurance don't even pay for it, so that there just goes through some kind of a central channel when all those expenses are covered if it's COVID related. Of course, the problem there is, how do you know what's COVID, what's not COVID? That's also, all of those things are going to have to be worked out before. And I don't, part of the problem, I don't see a unified front behind it to say, look, let's do this. It seems like every step up there is like a tug of war. So I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, sadly, I think you're right. Again, talking about the Democrats and the Republicans each pushing their own COVID-19 bill, and there's infighting on the Republican side, and of course there's infighting between the Republicans and the Democrats. So it's like games of tug of war within games of tug of war, with miniature ropes being tugged within the rope. Anyway, a quick question. We only have a few minutes left here. I was thinking of asking you the big question, which is, how would you try to solve the medical system? But we only have like 2 minutes left, so I'm not gonna put that on you.
How do you fix it? 2 minutes. Go.
Yeah, no. If you want to take it, go ahead. But I was thinking of turning somewhere else.
No, I'm not answering that.
Okay, for sure.
I'm here one person at a time. That's my job.
Exactly. I hear you. Yeah, that would be pretty unfair of me. So what I will turn to, especially since I know that we talked about with you briefly, we were talking in headlines this morning about Russia, which has declared that it has a vaccine. They've done tests. It seems to be working. They're planning on putting it into mass production this next month. And then they're saying that the head of basically Russia's sovereign wealth fund, I'm forgetting the exact name of the fund, but it's basically Russia's wealth fund. The head of this, which has been doing the investments and the research, is saying that they're planning on getting 50 million of these vaccines out to citizens of Russia, to Russian citizens, pretty soon. And they're saying that they want to have the entire country vaccinated by early next year. I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit there, putting the cart before the horse, because, of course, the question is, does the vaccine actually work? And that's where I turn to you. You don't have perfect inside knowledge, of course, but from your perspective, what's the likelihood that it works? What's your take on it, looking on it from the outside in?
Well, I think Russians are hyperinflating here something. I don't know exactly what, but the day before, my understanding that Bloomberg reported that it's just entering phase 3 in the first week of August, which would basically put this just a little bit behind what we current in the States, which there are several companies now that are there 4 possible vaccines. Some of them already doing the phase 3 trial. So I would believe more that scenario. Maybe the way they're sort of positioning the discussion is that they, it's pending the phase 3 trial result that they're going to have 50 million vaccines ready. I think that actually could be quite realistic. And China has the same way. They're already doing the phase 3, and I think they started phase 3 first. So just for clarity here, so you have phase 1 safety, phase 2 kind of a preliminary data of efficacy and more safety, and then phase 3 is where you actually look at the efficacy on a broader scheme, and then you can say, look, the vaccine has X% efficacy. I mean, the fact that I read in the report that Russia claims that every person give the vaccine to develop immunity, that's they should have been smarter to not say that, because that's impossible. No matter what vaccine is, it's not possible. So there's an individual immune variations. I think if we get vaccine that's 80% efficacious against this, I think everybody will be super happy. Let me give you an example. Flu vaccines globally in the past 5 years, the end of season efficacy was less than 25%.
30.
So that tells you something, right? So the efficacy
Dr. Kogan, I'm sorry, we've got to cut it there. Hopefully we can get you back on soon. I want to continue this conversation about vaccines. I also have a question about challenge trials with vaccines, but we can come back to that. Dr. Michael Kogan, founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute in Washington, D.C. We'll be back in just a minute for another great 2 hours. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the sick and seizing corner, I am investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to some headlines in the news. And I'm going to insert this one. We did not, I hate to have to even say this, but I know it needs to be said. Dr. Kogan, we did not cut Dr. Kogan because he was saying something against the Russian trials. I understand it's on the nose because this is Sputnik Radio, but we came up against the hour. That's the only reason Kogan was being left out. Otherwise, we would have talked to him for an hour. But going on to the first story, the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives vote to cut the Pentagon budget by 10% failed overnight, 93 to 324. This is the first time in decades that Congress has considered a substantial, quote-unquote, cut to the bloated Pentagon budget. Despite the rhetoric, which is always good during the campaign season about the military and military spending, the reality is, as this vote indicates, that both parties are still firmly behind the issue of war. Yes, pro-murder abroad. Love it. The United States has reported over 1,000 deaths per day, the first time since May. Yesterday afternoon, in his first solo press conference or solo briefing on the coronavirus in months, President Donald Trump warned that it will get worse. Let's not play that one. We played that one earlier. On Sunday, the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, said he may re-implement a stay-at-home order over the next week or two. Wow. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the next COVID bill passed by Congress will include more direct payments to individuals and families. The GOP wants to spend about $1 trillion, some of them. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said Monday that the goal was to keep the spending bill around $1 trillion, but Tuesday he had abandoned that. Democrats have proposed extending $600 per week benefits that expire at the end of the month until January, where Republicans will rather cut those benefits to $200 a week. Wow. 15 people were wounded Tuesday evening outside a funeral in Chicago where victims ranging 21 to 65 years old. After inhabitants of a car drove and started shooting, the attendants of the funeral began shooting back. The funeral was mourning a victim of gun violence. Twitter has banned 7,000 QAnon accounts, limits 15 or 150,000 others as part of a broad crackdown. A Twitter spokesperson said that while the targeted enforcement fell under Twitter's existing platform manipulation rules, its classification of QAnon material and behavior as coordinated harmful activity was a new designation. Last year, the FBI designated QAnon as a potential domestic terrorist threat. The FBI's report on QAnon's ties to dangerous real-world activities led in part to Twitter's decision, a spokesperson said. As someone who used to be a software engineer, I could tell you that if you were sitting in a company and they would come to you and say, how do you stop this because this is problematic, they probably would take that very seriously. So there's that. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Denmark today meeting the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, who last August called Trump's proposal to buy Greenland absurd. Pompeo is expected to discuss the coronavirus and China while there, and in addition to meeting with Prime Minister Frederiksen, will also be meeting with Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs along with the Minister of Greenland and Faroe Islands, signaling the Arctic is a priority for the visit. The United States has ordered the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston in a move the Chinese foreign minister today called outrageous and unjustified. State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus said the United States was acting to protect American intellectual property and Americans' private information, quote unquote. This follows an announcement by the Justice Department on Tuesday of an indictment charging 2 Chinese nationals, both in China, with hacking governments, dissidents, human rights activists, and private companies, including those engaged in COVID-19 vaccine research. China currently has its embassy in Washington and, in addition to Houston, consulates in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago. An article in China's Global Times, an outlet that's close to the ruling Communist Party, suggests that China could order the closure of U.S. consulate in Hong Kong in response to the State Department's latest decision. A hostage standoff aboard a bus in Ukraine ended yesterday shortly after Ukraine's President Zelensky promoted animal rights film Earthlings on social media at the request of a hostage taker who was a 44-year-old convicted criminal who liked to take care of stray dogs. Astonishing. Russia is reporting they've developed a working COVID-19 vaccine and will begin mass production next month with the goal of inoculating its population in autumn. The chief executive of the Russian Direct Investment Fund has said 50 million Russians, or a third of the population, could be vaccinated in the near future. And last but not least, Trump was asked in his press conference about Ghislaine Maxwell, the fixer for apex predator Jeffrey Epstein. Trump quickly dodged the question, saying he wished her well. Trump and Bill Clinton's relationship with Epstein and Maxwell is very well established in photographic record and by their own statements, even though neither of the men have been willing to divulge details of that relationship. In Trump's case, what he says, however, indicates that he knows more, and he has implicated himself with this relationship. You've been listening to Fault Lines. Those are your headlines. This is Thomas and Stranahan. So, Shane, the one I want to go to first has to be the Trump thing, because this one has interested me and I found to be so curious of all things. Now, if your name is Donald Trump and you know that there is a paper trail, photographic trail, and your own mouth going back for the history of Epstein, what do you deal with that? How do you deal with that? Now, Bill Clinton has had the sense enough to just shut up and not say anything, but Trump is the president of the United States. Trump likes to give press conferences, and old videos that Trump has had has caught up with him that indicates that he knows more than what he is letting on. Let's hear Trump being pressed on this in a press conference. This is the Trump presser talking about, This is Trump presser talking about Ghislaine Maxwell. Let's play the clip.
I don't know. I haven't really been following it too much. I just wish her well, frankly. I've met her numerous times over the years, especially since I lived in Palm Beach, and I guess they lived in Palm Beach. But I wish her well, whatever it is. I don't know the situation with Prince Andrew. Just don't know. Not aware of it.
I don't know the situation with Prince Andrew. I just don't know. I don't know anything about this. Let's move to the next question. Now, the problem is, Trump does know something about Prince Andrew. How do I know this? Because Donald Trump told me so. Now, let's play the previous clip where Trump brings up Prince Andrew and talks about it as a cesspool. Let's play the clip.
That island was really a cesspool. There's no question about it. Just ask Prince Andrew. He'll tell you about it. The island was an absolute cesspool.
What do you mean cesspool, Trump? What do you mean, Prince Andrew? What do you mean by cesspool? Be specific. What is your definition of cesspool? What is that yada-yadaing over when you're making the term cesspool? Clearly, there was something there that you thought was, oh, that's horrendous. Fair enough. Tell us about it. And if you're going to implicate Prince Andrew has given a disastrous interview, that makes it very plainly clear, at the very least, that something is wrong with this picture. I don't know the level of hubris and mendacity that functions within a person's brain where they're like, yeah, I'm going to just nail that interview. Just bam, I'm just going to do it. You didn't nail it. And maybe it's the hubris of walking around saying that you were appointed by God that allows you to believe that an interview like that is going to come off well. You were not appointed by God. I need proof of that. And beyond that point, that interview did not go well at all. You looked guilty of sin. Now, the catch becomes if Donald Trump is bringing up Prince Andrew's name in something that is called a cesspool, and he's talking about pedophile Allen, then I have to ask, what does Donald Trump know about this? So the press needs to be very specific on what they're asking Donald Trump, because they were sheepish about it before. Hey, Trump, in 2015, you said that the Allen, that Prince Andrew and that Jeffrey Epstein was engaged in was a cesspool. What do you mean by cesspool? And what do you know about Prince Andrew's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, especially in the context of that Allen? Oh, there's a litany of questions that just start from this particular moment that needs to be asked about the President of the United States. Shane, what do you think about this? You follow this issue with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and all. I want all of these people to ask questions on this stuff, not just Prince Andrew. If you're going to reach out to Prince Andrew, then you've already set the precedent right there that people who know something about this should be asked about it. And the fact that Trump has implicated himself to some degree means that Trump should also be asked about this. What do you think?
I think this is one of those great stories that punctures the barrier between the establishment media and the real media, like the media that takes place online and in some establishment venues. This is one of those. So this came out, obviously the story is much older than a year, but last year, June, July, August, especially August, the story really broke. And since then, there's been a kind of weird media silence on closing up the loose ends, the loose threads of the story, of which there are many. All of the weird intelligence stuff, why Alex Acosta, former labor secretary, one-time judge in Florida, who got the call from higher ups that basically let Epstein get away with a lot of this stuff. Again, you can go back. There's a Daily Beast article. Alex Acosta talks about how he got a call from higher ups, people above him, who effectively pressured him through that phone call into giving Epstein a sweetheart deal, with the hopefully not much innuendo on the sweetheart part of the sweetheart deal, knowing Epstein's proclivities.
It's worse than that. Wait, it's worse than that.
Go
because
for it. Yeah,
notice,
go, Jamarl.
One of the arguments that Ghislaine Maxwell is making is basically, look, the deal that you gave Epstein meant and said everybody associated with him. Meaning it wasn't just Epstein. The deal that Acosta gave Epstein, that he basically said, okay, you're going to plead to prostitution counts or whatever. Whatever that deal was, though, it also said, and your associates, people who were working with Epstein, meaning that deal that he took covered several people that were involved. They were not even named in the suit. It's astonishing. And when Ghislaine Maxwell made her argument, one of the arguments was made was, you said, based on the deal that you made with Acosta that was recently upheld in court, that anybody else that was associated with Epstein was fair game. Well, I might have been associated with Epstein.
I want to get a lawyer on. Yeah, I want to get a lawyer on to talk about whether or not that's legal. What precedent there would be for that kind of a ruling, because that just seems ludicrous. How can it be the case if there are a lot of people committing a crime, say, and you take the person who seems to be the center of it, and you're charging just them? You know what I mean? You're going after just them.
Right.
That doesn't seem like, where does that come from?
It happens every day.
Circumvention of the law?
No, it happens every day. Say, for example, that you were, I don't know, let's say you got some illness and you needed to make sure that the money for your family and everything was intact. So you started doing drug running. And let's say maybe your wife hid something because your wife loved you and your wife didn't want you to get caught or whatever. And the feds say, look, we got you caught. And we're going to go after your wife because we don't have the goods on you, but we have this thing that your wife committed. And you may say, as a husband who loved your wife, you wouldn't do like the governor of Virginia did, where he threw his wife under the bus. You wouldn't do that. What you would do is you would say, I love my wife, and fine, I'll take the charges. You got me. It's what they use to put the screws on you. Well, I'm going to protect this person and that person, and I'll take the hit myself for the crime. They do it every day.
So it's just the details of the plea deal, basically, and they can sort of put whatever they want to in the plea deal, as long as it doesn't break some weird law.
I'm not a lawyer, so you're right. You need to bring somebody on for that. But as my understanding is, people do that, where they say, look, I'll take the blame, providing you cover all of these other people that might be involved. It's just, in this case, it just sounds so gross.
I want to get a lawyer in to talk about that. That does still seem weird. I hear what you're saying, and that perspective on it, it seems valid in its own right. But again, you see what I'm saying too. That shouldn't happen because otherwise, any one of these larger conspiracies, and we can call this a conspiracy pretty damn accurately, any one of these larger conspiracies in any domain of conspiracy, you could have this happen where somebody steps up, they get charged, and then basically by having a tie-in with federal prosecutors or whomever, they're able to get their cronies off. They're able to get their friends and associates off. That shouldn't be happening in our justice system, especially since it doesn't appear that anything really was done with the information back in 2008 when this ruling came down. It doesn't seem like there was this massive branching investigation, which there very well could have been. There was plenty of fruit. There was plenty of material for a larger investigation. I started on that.
Oh, it stopped it.
This idea of
that was the point. It stopped it.
Yes, exactly. It stopped it.
That was the entire point of the Acosta's deal. Yeah.
So coming back to the idea of the media, and this being one of those stories that the media could puncture if the media had any guts, any cojones whatsoever, they haven't done that, obviously. And this is where it comes back to Trump. In my own way, I just think that Trump's response here is absolutely hilarious. And that's maybe an inappropriate reaction. But he's like, well, I wish her well.
Wish her well.
Out of touch. How the hell out of touch do you have to be? Yeah, he's saying his own thing. They've met. They have whatever personal relationship they had. But just from the perspective of the public, from the perspective of anybody who's been paying any attention to this story, that response almost seems a little bit like trolling to me. You know what I mean? I don't know if that's what that is from his end.
I think it's a guilty man that got caught and stuck on his own petard and is trying to get away from the question. That's what I think. I'm sorry. But wait. We have to wrap. We're at the end.
Okay, for sure.
This is Thomas Stranahan. This is a great conversation. Maybe we'll pick it up going into the next one. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're taking calls this segment. You can call in 202-521-1320 is the number to call. I'll do that again a little bit slower this time. 202-521-1320. That's the number you want to call if you want to call us. We're also going to be interviewing Manila Chan next segment and the segment after that. So that's going to be at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. Then at 9:15 Eastern, we're talking with Ted Rall. Then at 9:30 Eastern, we're talking with John Kiriakou. So if you're listening in, if you can't see our Twitter feed, if you can't see our sort of public list of guests, that's what we're doing. And in the last hour at 7:30, we interviewed Dr. Mikhail Kogan about the coronavirus, about the sort of medical crisis he sees looming here, specifically the financial crisis, where a lot of people just aren't going to be able to afford to pay the huge medical bills they're undoubtedly going to face if they get COVID-19 and need hospitalization. That's coming, he says. We also talked about some of the possible complications of the coronavirus, stuff like that. It was an interesting conversation. But again, next up, we're talking with Manila Chan. With that out of the way, yeah, man, I don't know. The trolling thing with Trump here on the Ghislaine Maxwell comments, that's probably not entirely accurate on my part, but that's the sense that I got. At the very least, I thought it was just so tune deaf. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so ludicrous of a response. It's like, because the reporter who's asking that is asking it based on that 2015 video. He has to. And because he's basically saying, look, you've had a relationship with Prince Andrew. You mentioned it in regards to Epstein. So what do you know? But the reporter didn't have the stones to go all in on that question. Like, he's like, I'm dealing with the president. I want to answer. Screw that. You're talking to somebody who basically self-implicated themselves on this issue. Nobody, whatever Trump was having a conversation about, remember, Trump has said stuff about this before, right? When he was talking about Epstein, he says, oh, yeah, he likes those women young, as if he was kind of giving a nod. Like there's something in him that he knows that is screaming to come out, and he just doesn't want to say, but it leaks out over the course of time. And now he's president. He's like, that stuff is radioactive. I don't want to touch it. It's like, yeah, but you've touched it in the past, Trump, which indicates that you know something. I got to be honest. I don't know how federal authorities go and say, we want to talk to Prince Andrew, but not talk to Trump. How?
I kind of want to know.
And I'm not saying this,
I
by
wanna
the
know
way, from a
which-
biased partisan perspective. I'm saying this entirely from the perspective that he's implicated himself in this based on his own rhetoric and conversation.
I hear you. I'm looking to figure out who said which reporter said this, what outlet they were with, because my gut says it's not that they didn't ask the follow-up question or they didn't ask the full question because they were afraid of Trump or they were trying to steer clear of his prowess or his might or whatever. It's just that, they work for an outlet. They're the kind of person who's a bit cautious about this story. And that's part of the thing over the last year and such, over the last year and some change. I think this is one of those stories where the people who are covering it don't know how the heck to treat it. Like they're used to treating this kind of thing as a conspiracy theory, and then suddenly it starts to break into the wider media. And there are all of these parts where they're probably kind of suspicious about it, and they're starting to think it's a conspiracy theory themselves, but they don't know how far they can step outside of the sort of traditional bounds when it comes to this kind of thing. You see what I'm saying with that?
Yeah, I think you're right about this. I think you're right. They don't know how to deal with the story. So it's like, even though they would think Trump might know something based on what Trump said, it's like, how far do we go? How far do we go? That's fascinating. Exactly. God, that's fascinating. We have callers. Let's go to Kenny in Baltimore. Kenny, what's going on?
Hey, how you guys doing? I wanted to just suggest somebody for you all to talk to. About a little more than a year ago, Lee and Garland had a fellow on named Mike McGee, and he wrote a book called Code Blue Inside America's Medical Industrial Complex. He was a really interesting guest. He's got a pretty nice website, and he might be somebody to talk to about the, where to go with healthcare.
That's great. Thanks for the advice. Reaching back into the back catalog.
It was really interesting, and I wake up, I get my breakfast, I sit down and listen to you guys every morning. And I was a little late today, and I sit down, and the first thing I hear is about how the bill didn't pass about the cutting the Pentagon's budget.
Military budget.
It just completely deflated me for the day. And can you give the number on that? What was the vote on that? Was it crushed? It was just crushed,
it was crushed. The number was, let's see,
93 to 324. 93 to 324.
324 of them.
Ayes to 324 nays. And that I would call that pretty crushed. Yeah, it wasn't close.
Do you think that with the protests going on, if somehow there had been more of a presence with the protests concerning that, somehow that maybe it would have stood a better chance? Because I honestly thought in today's environment that now you think it was just, I guess I'm just a little
I think all of these guys have a particular perspective regarding war. I just do. To be fair, it's incentivized in some respects. I mean, think of the military contracts in the various states that these senators or House of Representative members have to attend to. And I'm telling you, the moment that they cut that budget, what one of the people running against them are going to say is, they lost. This Congressman X has lost all of these jobs because he wouldn't necessarily back this particular thing in the budget. And that congressman is going to be struggling to explain how they lost all those jobs for him and say, look, the military budget has to come down. Yeah, but at the expense of our workers. Like, it gets really dicey when you get into these kind of conversations about the military budget, because it does mean real things in regards to those particular areas, and those people can be attacked for it. No, I honestly think, I thought this thing was dead on arrival to begin with. Look, until you get you have a situation where thank you for the call, Kenny. Thank you for the call, man.
Okay.
Shane, I think, honestly, until you get to the point where the military is not a jobs program, you have trouble cutting it. And, it's like for all of the talk about, let's cut the military budget, that's more ethereal. The reality of it becomes, but what does that mean in real terms? And if that in real terms means jobs, are the congressmen going to be able to politically do it, even if it's right, and even if it's what the public wants, again, in a larger sense? Those are difficult questions for these guys to grapple with. It's not that I agree with them. More so, the budget needs to be cut. It's more so that you must understand the pressures that are being put on the congressmen in order to even get the budget to where it is in the first place, and why that budget continues to go up.
Yeah, I would put there are 4 factors I see here, and that might be too many. I'll try to keep it relatively simple. Four factors. One, there's the inherent incentive in the weight of the military-industrial complex, just as an industry. Again, you're saying it's a jobs program. That's absolutely true. A lot of money goes into employing people. A lot of money also goes into lining the pockets of the people who have ownership of these mill-end companies. So that's one factor. There's just this inherent economy there. Factor two is public perception, public opinion. That has definitely shifted over the years, but as far as I can tell, it's largely been distracted by more trivial issues. Again, the public conversation for years now hasn't been about how do we reduce our overseas involvement. That hasn't been number one or number three or even number five in terms of at least of what people are talking about, what people are hearing about on the media. Largely, it's been anti-Trump stuff or anti-Biden stuff. And, it's not just because we're in election year. It's also because the last 4 years have been like a continuation of the 2016 election year. And so we're sort of still living in that transition of power. Factors number 3 and number 4, real quick here. Factor number 3 is something like our genuine military situation internationally, like our position, whether we can justify materially investing as much money as we're continuing to invest in building up our military and sustaining it. And then factor number 4 is the perspectives of the elites who are actually making these changes. So there are 4 factors there, sort of perspective and reality from this high-level foreign policy perspective. Then there's the public perception of things. And then there's the economy, the militant economy, which, again, is a big economy within the American economy. I don't see any of those factors having changed enough in the last couple of years, with the exception maybe of our material position in the world. I don't see any of those factors changing quickly enough that I would expect to see real cuts to the Pentagon's budget or real other efforts to sort of pull back on our entrenchment when it comes to a lot of this stuff. It's going to take a while. It's going to take a sea change. And there's probably going to be this lagging reality. Hopefully we can face it soon enough as we get weaker internationally, as our ties, are frayed by our own actions and just the weight of what we're trying to sustain. As our position gets weaker and the world shifts back into the sort of multipolar setup, that's going to happen. And then there's probably going to be a lag after that before we realize it. And hopefully we don't get into a war in the intervening period, because that would mean a lot of lost lives and possibly just the whole dragging down of this process. It would cause us to massively invest in our military, probably not what we should be doing. We have better things to do with our money. But that's my take, is it's going to be a sea change. It's going to be a longer process. Let's go to we have Michael from Silver Spring. Michael,
I think you're right.
You want to go first, Jamarl?
No, I was just going to say I think you're right. I think that the terror or the fear in that is that the military is used to supplant what was soft power. Meaning it's like, all right, we can't necessarily deal with the economic factors anymore. We can't deal with this other stuff. We're in a multipolar world. But then using the military to compensate, which would invariably lead you into a standoff or some kind of war.
Yeah.
So, I agree.
That's the sad thing. And then you combine that with the Thucydides trap we've talked about. It's a mess. And so I think we need to get ahead of this conversation and start having it before we get into the real rut that I see us getting into within the next couple of years. In any event.
Well, speaking of that, wait. Speaking of that, this is perfect.
Yeah.
Let's play the clip with Joe Biden screaming about sovereignty. I think it's just for 30 seconds. But this is perfect. This goes exactly what we're talking about, where you have basically, you're positioning yourself off with the nuclear power.
Putin knows I mean what I say. This is a violation of our sovereignty. Our sovereignty. And if in fact it occurs, there will be response in kind. It will not go unstated, unnoticed, or unreported.
Off the top of my head, Iran, Guatemala, Honduras, Brazil, all sorts of countries in Vietnam. All of these countries were invaded from the standpoint of sovereignty. Nobody cared one iota, especially not Joe Biden. Even Libya, where they're selling slaves right now. The notion that you're going to make an argument that somebody breached your sovereignty for a hack that didn't exist over Twitter and Facebook ads that were most likely associated with a private entity trying to make profit is obscene. This is like brinksmanship at a level that is obscene. He's basically positioning himself in a standoff with another nuclear power nation. This is kind of what we mean when we show this stuff of like the way Democrats have responded in this loss to Donald Trump, where they couldn't even deal with the reality of it. It went into just conspiracy theory that has been destroyed over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. The declining political might could lead into larger consequences. So
and also we have stressing the sovereignty. Real quick, he was stressing the sovereignty. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Like you said at the beginning, that he's falling back on this moral high ground thing. I mean, we should have been doing that all along. We should have been respecting other people's sovereignty, other nations' sovereignty. Pardon me. We haven't been, and so for anybody who's paying any attention, it just immediately deflates the whole ethical house he's built. It's a house of cards. In any event, like you said, we have Michael from Silver Spring on the line. Michael, what's going on?
Yes, I want to agree with your point, Shane, your 4 points, and I agree with everything. You know, this whole sovereignty thing. You know, what does that really mean? Everyone's a human being, and so, like mentioned before, if governments can just print out money without any consequence, then what is the restraint? What is this budget restraint? The government has the power to moderate prices. But anyway, back, to the last caller, the last guest, the doctor, he mentioned the Alzheimer's possibly being a consequence of COVID. And I just want to say that oftentimes most people understand that it's 70 and above, 70 years old and above. When you go to the hospitals, they give you a drug called some type of psychotropic drug, which makes you appear to family members and friends that you're incapacitated. And the incapacitation, they basically trap you, and they basically take your money by filling beds, and they take your insurance money. But the thing is that, and that's a fact, and that's not but what I'm saying is that how come the doctor didn't mention, and no one's mentioned with respect to this lacking news that we get, this lacking, follow-up. Like, if children go back to school, then, and they carry the disease, the COVID disease, then won't they bring it back to their parents? How come we didn't mention that?
Yes.
Those are my questions.
Yes. Thank you, Michael. Let's take a break, and we'll come back. I do want to take 30 seconds to talk about this, but we do need to take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're joined for this segment and the next by Manila Chan. Before I intro Manila, hello Manila. Before I intro you, I just want to throw out a breaking news update. The U.S. government has reached a $1.95 billion deal with Pfizer and BioNTech, two companies, to distribute millions of doses of a potential coronavirus vaccine. I'm just seeing that coming through now. I haven't done more research than that. That's the headline, though. It's coming over from the Washington Post in the last few minutes. With that out of the way, we do have Manila Chan on the line. Manila is a veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program, In Question. Manila, how are you doing this morning?
Hi, guys. Good morning. Good. How are you?
Good. Yeah, doing well. Interesting stuff here. Jamarl, I'll actually pass it back over to you. You said you wanted to respond to the caller's last couple of statements there. Do you want to pick it up and take that away for a minute?
Yeah, just for 30 seconds. The caller's right. Just because a kid, and the doctor did mention that, by the way, he did make the point that said kids can carry that and take it back to their family members, even if the kids themselves are not necessarily all that sick. So just to give a heads up to Kogan did mention that point. And he's right. So right. Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't a huge point. It was just to make the point that, yeah, he did mention it. He did make reference to the fact that the adults are susceptible, even if younger kids are less likely to be in the transmission.
And that last caller.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi. All right.
Yeah, Manila. Oh man, we're bumping into each other.
This is one of those. Yeah, you step back left and step right. I mean, my real quick comment with that last caller, he should call in when we have Dr. McKelkogan on. I'll try to remember the question he asked about people being put basically into comas. I think is what he was saying, put into comas in order to sort of leech money off of them. I don't buy that, but we'll talk talk about that with Dr. McKelkogan next time. In any event, we have Manila John on. We're planning on talking with you about schooling and also Portland's wall of moms. But let's I suppose, you know what? I can't help. I kind of want to start with that second one just because it sounds weird as all get out. What is Portland's wall of moms? I've been seeing Portland's protests, but do you know what's going on over there with the moms, Manila?
Hey guys, I wish I could fill you in more with exactly what was going on in Portland, but as we know, it's been 50 some odd days since the George Floyd protests have been going on. Portland's been ongoing. It looks to me I'm not on the ground and unfortunately I don't have any eyes and ears on the ground to report back to you guys, but from all the reports that I've seen and the investigations I've done into the wall of moms, as far as I can see, they are just a band of women with color coordinated shirts who are basically, whether they are or are not mothers, we can't confirm, but there are a bunch of women that are wearing color coordinated shirts and helmets and basically protecting the protesters, what they say is protecting the protesters from federal authorities or police or whatever authority are out there, because that we can't be sure of because they're not really identifying themselves. But they are banding together, linking arms, and kind of making this human chain to, as they say, protect the protesters. To me, I kind of view that as sort of a stunt. I don't know what kind of group they are. Not a lot of information floating around out there as to who's leading this movement or who they actually are, but they seem to have spontaneously spawned up and are showing up on the scene and getting a lot of press about it because it is a coordinated effort. It has been peaceful on their part, we can say that, but they say that they are moms and that they're protecting. I wouldn't necessarily say the protesters are all kids, but they are obviously somebody's children. They may be over 18, but they are somebody's children, and they say they're protecting them.
That's interesting. Yeah,
that's interesting. Stunt. Now, when you say stunt, do you mean that is that word used as positive or negative, like from your perspective when you're thinking of the people who are out there doing it?
I would say I'm more of I wouldn't say it's necessarily negative, but I don't buy it as something truly genuine and meaningful. I think it's just a group of women that choose to identify themselves as such, and there's probably something to gain. I mean, once you start covering these protests as I have for many years, whether it was in the Middle East or domestically, you start to see a trend where some groups have something to gain. I don't know who these women are. I'm not there on the ground, so I can't verify the validity of their movement, if it is a movement. But I do think it is something that they're doing as a coordinated effort to gain attention.
That's fair. Okay, that's fair. I guess
I'm looking at
it. Go ahead, Shane.
Oh, pardon me. Just looking at it real quick, it seems like they're acting sort of as a human shield. So they're doing the wall of moms thing in between the protesters and either local law enforcement or the federal officials that have been sent into Portland. So again, that seems to be the sort of role that they're playing. And as moms, I think moms are a uniquely effective. This is going to sound terrible, but a uniquely effective human shield. I don't think anybody wants to harm a mom, and so it's really just what they're protecting. You know what I mean? What the protesters are doing. If they're doing stuff that's egregious, and then the moms are protecting that doesn't seem right to me. If they're doing stuff that's reasonable, and the law enforcement and the unmarked federal officials are doing stuff that's egregious, then it does seem reasonable to me. That's my take.
Right. I'm with you on that, Shane. I mean, I haven't been there, and there hasn't been too much live media coverage of what these women are doing. But like you said, if they are shielding these young people who are peacefully protesting, then I get it. I'm a mom. I would protect my kid that was out there protesting too. But if they are protecting young people who are, looting and rioting and doing the bad stuff, then those would be the wall of moms who are enabling bad behavior. So again, I don't know what these women are doing and who they actually are, but right now, whatever they're doing seems reasonable, and they're getting themselves some media attention.
With the people who are protesting right now in Portland, and it seems like the protests have swelled as a result of actions that Trump has basically swelled the protests by sending in authorities and sending in black hats to cause, I would say, harm, especially in the context of Portland being able to basically, where the protests were dying down. From the standpoint of the rest of the country, Trump has made this argument that he is going to basically, or potentially, send troops into countries or into states that are basically Democratic governors or Democratic mayors who he doesn't necessarily like the way they're going about their business. Considering that he has recently had a conversation with, what is his name, John Hu, the gentleman who approved the torture memo for Bush, that doesn't necessarily bode well for any notion of, I don't know, restraints on power in regards to the federal government. Have we seen something like this before, where the where the president takes it upon himself to basically use the military in the very different, or let's say federal authorities that he has access with in the various states, despite the governments or the governors not wanting those things to take place? I can think of civil rights, but beyond that, I can't necessarily think of a president using that authority in those ways, at least not in recent memory.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. I would say, at least not to this degree of using federal authorities on various states that he's obviously sent them to. These particular states we're talking about are democratically run. Those governors have not asked for that kind of help. I mean, he's obviously stopping short of using the Insurrection Act, but the fact that there's two sides to this, right? The fact that there are federal properties that risk being torched, damaged, looted, rioted in. I get where the feds want to go in there and protect their stuff, right? But on the other hand, I have also been present at protests. Like I'll use Baltimore, for example, because that was in recent memory. The use of federal authorities there, or even police that were geared up to look like the military, definitely increased tensions and did not help as things were dying down. The last couple of days of the Freddie Gray riot, it was a lot of street celebrations. There were people, a city trying to come together. They had already simmered down, and they were trying to pick themselves back up from this horrible event that transpired with this young man, right? And that was during the Obama years. And there were National Guard troops there. And I would definitely say, because I witnessed it, it didn't make the crowd feel any better. And at that point, the rioting and the rabble-rousing was done. It was gone. It was over, at least in 48 hours prior. And the use of having any sort of military-looking men and women there armed definitely never helps the situation. And I can't say that it's helping out in Portland either.
Yeah, one quick comment here. I don't like the use of the unmarked troops. This is the 54th consecutive day of protests in Portland. I think you were saying something like 50 some odd days. I think it's 54 as of today. That's the official number. And a lot of we've been going back and forth on the protests, and specifically this issue of violence, and also this issue of justification, whether they're justified, at least emotionally, in this emotional sense, in protesting in the way that they are, specifically when it gets into rioting, when it gets into destroying things. Originally, I'll just point this out and sort of demarcate a couple of different things. Months earlier, when all this stuff kicked off, there was looting going on. That's different from rioting, obviously, but I'm just feeling the need to sort of very clearly separate those things out. Looting, you're taking things; rioting, you're basically breaking things, or that converge into arson, that converge into other versions of destruction of public property, or public endangerment, where you're hurting other people. But a riot is this sort of loose, more active, non-thefty version of public unrest. It seems like we've pretty much shifted from looting into occasional rioting. And those riots are sort of interspersed, as far as I can tell, every couple of nights or every week or so with the general protesting going on. You add in the tearing down statues, and it's like this sort of, my point is, it's this weird gradient of activity, from protesting to removing public property to destroying public property, including, police enforcement, the offices recently in Portland of the police union, as well as in Seattle. You had the sort of temporary destruction, partial destruction, and then occupation of the actual police office there in Seattle, inside the Chaz. So there's this gradient of activity, and what we've been going back and forth on is whether this is justified. Whether these different degrees of activity are justified, and what it would even make sense, how it would even make sense, how we can make sense of the idea of justification for these kinds of acts. I want to come back to that. That was a little bit rambly. We'll be back with Manila in just a minute. We're going into a break. I want to hear her thoughts on this, specifically the issue of justification and what she believes is justified here. But we'll be back with her in a minute to talk about this. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back again. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are joined for this segment, as an extension of the last segment, by Manila Chan. She is a TV host over at RT. She hosts the daily news program In Questions. She's also a veteran news anchor. Anyway, we went into a break last time. I was asking a rambly question where I said the word justification a bunch of times. Manila, hopefully you made sense of that. We were getting at this issue of what's justified when it comes to violence, the destruction of public property, tearing down statues. Protesting seems justified. But what's your take on that sort of continuum of issues?
I don't know if you mean anything that would I justify rioting or looting or the destruction of property? No, absolutely not. At no point, I think, is that ever acceptable in any way, because there's a trickle effect of what happens after those events. But in terms of, is the president justified with sending unmarked federal authorities to deal with peaceful protesters? I think that is unjustified. Again, as we were saying, continuing from the last segment, is that it seems like all the violence in Portland had simmered down by the time these unmarked authorities were showing up there. And again, from my personal experience, and I think a lot of reporters that have been on the ground, that cut their teeth out on the field before they sit on the anchor desk, can tell you that having federal authorities show up with weapons, with, MRAP and these uniforms that are indistinguishable from the U.S. Army or whatever other military force there might be, when it's indistinguishable, it just raises the temperature. Not even if you're a protester. I mean, speaking as a reporter, wearing a press badge, wearing a flat jacket that says press, it really, really makes it a lot more tense and I think difficult for feelings to simmer down and for everybody to reconnect and focus on whatever the original protest goal was. So right now, I don't find it really necessary for the feds to be there, to have authorities there. I think that's unjustified at the moment.
I hear you, and I agree with you. This is... Yeah, go ahead, Jamarl.
No. Finish your comment. I apologize.
No, you're good. No, yeah, I hear you and I agree with you. I've been focusing, we've gone into this a couple of times before, Jamarl and I. I've been focusing on the protesters simply because I don't think the government's going to listen to me. If I'm going to have any influence on anybody's sort of emotions or perspective or their take or how they do things, to the extent that I even should, because I don't know that I should. But if I'm going to have that influence, I think I'm going to have that feasibly on some small subset of the people who are doing the protesting. I want to criticize the federal government, and I do, but I don't think they're actually listening to me. I don't think they have any care in the slightest degree what I or anybody in my position would be saying to them. And so I've sort of been focusing on the protesters because that's where I think I can make the most difference. But again, I don't think that what they're doing is justified either. One slight caveat that I'll throw in here, but I'm just throwing this in to sort of give some contrast, is the idea that the local officials and the mayors, for instance, mainly the mayors, haven't been doing enough to crack down on the protests themselves, and so public property is getting destroyed. If you have a police unions building getting torched, that kind of thing, that's pretty expensive to rebuild, and that would be their expense. So I understand why Trump would sort of want to come down, but then I'm a localist, so I think that ultimately it should be in their hands anyway. What's your take on that, Manila?
I think I'm leaning towards the same perspective. I mean, like I said, there's a ripple effect, right? When local municipalities don't do enough to crack down, let's say it's not a riot or a protest. Let's say it's not the Chaz or Chop Zone or whatever it's evolved into. Let's say it's gang violence, and gangs overtook a certain community, a certain area of town, and they harass the denizens of that community. They even, let's say they did what they did in the Chop Zone. They took over the police department somehow. That's hijacking a police department. If the mayor doesn't do something about it, again, it makes sense that any president, let's not call it Donald Trump, any president that was there would be worried about the denizens of that community and the police officers who were there that are being chased out by potentially armed rioters, people that are just there to destroy. And I mean, they burnt down the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis. They burned that one down. I get why you would want to send federal authorities, because if you feel that the local municipality is lacking in protecting the overall populace, then the federal government has to play a role to protect citizens of this country at large, not just that little local municipality. As far as I can tell, though, again, with this Portland stuff, it has simmered down. So I don't know how you can justify keeping federal armed guards basically on the ground there.
I agree with you. I think I agree with you on that in broad general strokes. For some reason, I'm slightly against it, and even though I agree with you mainly, I agree that all things being equal, the last thing you want is for a police station to be burnt down. That's the last thing. That looks like chaos. And, I am not a big fan necessarily of, under normal circumstances, having people needing to walk up and down the street, or for that matter, riot or loot or any of those things. And under normal circumstances, I think most people would probably agree with that. That even the people who are marching and who are protesting will probably say, I don't want to be out here. All things being equal, I prefer not to be out of my house in this way. And I accept, though, that within the context of that, there's always going to be a small percentage of people who want to start carnage. And it makes it difficult sometimes to see making them indistinct in regards to the people who want to start carnage versus the larger majority of people who just want to get their message out from the standpoint of the protests. It's almost like there's always a percentage that tries to take advantage. So fair enough. When I look at a society, though, and I see a society where the people are put into really difficult situations based purely on acts of policy. Like, for example, the death toll, the differential between the number of blacks or Hispanics who are dying in relation to the number of whites. Some of that has to do with the jobs they were taking. Some of that has to do with comorbidities that were associated with their own health and weaknesses. Some of those are economic. Some of those are just physical. When you add all this stuff together, and you have like 40, 50 years of a population that is basically abandoned and ignored, nearly half of the population. I mean, this is the richest country on the planet, but nearly half of it is in poverty. Can I really wring my hands at what seems to be a response, not necessarily a primary issue. Meaning in a different world where you don't necessarily have all these inequities, be it of justice or for that matter, economic conditions, this doesn't exist. You don't get these protests. In Denmark, under normal circumstances, as the Danish man said, you guys are nuts because of the way you run your system. You get these protests in America after 40, 50, 60 years of the population basically being left to their own devices. And then you get a presidential election where your outcomes are Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Now, tell me, under those situations and circumstances, taking out right, wrong, good, bad, indifferent, and everything else, and just looking at the factors to which you're presented with, is it foreseeable that something like this happens? And are those people who are living with this kind of absolute impersonal violence of, be it economic or be it social, racial, all of these injustices and the deficits are presented with those things, is it insane for those people to react in ways that may be, let's say, not necessarily the most effective in trying to remedy their ends, but definitely an outcome that is somewhat startling in and of itself, considering what they've had to endure over the last 40, 50 years? Is that true or false? Meaning, wringing your hands over them burning the fire department or the police station down is one thing, but that didn't come out of the ether. That came out of basic effects that were taking place over the course of time that we ignored. Is that a fair appraisal of what's taken place?
Yeah, actually, Jamarl, I would say that is. I mean, I would venture out to go as far as to say the majority of people who are protesting, not just this with BLM or what have you, but I mean, over the years, over the decades, like you said, 40, 50, 60 years since the civil rights movement, going out there to march, being confronted with police or the anti-protesters or what have you, going out there to march is not usually your first task, right? Like you don't go out, that's not the first thing you decide to do. You go out there and scream and shout and carry your signs in mass because it comes from years of consternation and anger and anguish of the inability of, and it starts all local, right? Local municipalities all the way up here to Washington, D.C., of really being able to spark real change in this society or any effective, measurable, meaningful change. So I think people resolve to have their voices heard some way or another, because if it's not in the halls of Congress, then it's going to be on the streets. And I think that's what we're seeing today, as we've seen, every so often in the course of the past 50 years.
Another side here with the United States, and I'm actually going to bring France into this. If I look at the EU, it seems like France has the most active, consistent sort of protest base. I mean, there are other countries who have protesters, but France, it seems kind of famous to me for having almost yearly semi-monthly.
Yes, it is.
That's the thing. I think that there's even a historical explanation. If you look back, there was the American Revolution. Shortly afterwards, there was the French Revolution. These were the two big sort of official national revolutions that actually kind of worked in the quote unquote West at that point, in the Western civilization broadly during that period. I think we might still be living in the legacy of that. I think that might be contributing on both ends of the Atlantic. I mean, in the United States, and this is kind of what I was getting at with the justification thing earlier. I'll close with this. And then I'll pass it back to you, Manila. We only have about a minute and a half before we have to go out here. Thank you for joining us. But it's this idea that I can understand emotionally the built-up energy, the built-up frustration. I can understand that there are effectively only two outlets if you want to make change on a national scale. One is voting. The other is protesting, unless you want to become a political player yourself, which is like a big investment of your time. So I understand the frustration there, but that doesn't, again, I don't understand how we can sort of straddle this divide of understanding emotionally the justification while disapproving officially and verbally of like where those emotions turn into violence, specifically violence against property, but also violence against people, which we've seen. I mean, a quick note here before I pass it back over to you. Minnesota, there was a pawn shop where I'd heard that somebody might have died in the pawn shop during this protest, looting, rioting thing. And just yesterday in the New York Times, police investigated. Yes, they found a burnt down body in the pawn shop. Somebody was trying to get out. They were trying to keep their shop from being burnt, and they died there. So it does, again, it's not the first, it's not the only. It's just notable because it just happened. There are people dying from this too. But coming back to this question, how do we have that conversation? If we understand what they're doing emotionally, but we disapprove of what they're actually doing, how do you think we should go about handling that, Manila?
Well, I mean, I don't think any of us have. I certainly don't have that kind of answer because, like I said, I think when the people gather on the streets and demand to have their voices heard, it is a last resort. It is not the first thing people turn to. It's the elected officials. First of all, like you said, it's an election year. We keep electing the same. It doesn't matter what their names are. We keep electing the same people. They are all cut from the same cloth. We keep choosing two ponies to run this race for us and represent us. That is foolish. Until there is a tidal change in the way we run elections, the people we elect, we are going to continue down the same path that we are seeing right now. And by the way, before we go, I have to put this in there. I have to throw this out there that all these protests are happening amidst all this COVID stuff, right? So it's really been a hot mess tinderbox.
Yeah. Yes, it's all tied together. I'm sorry, Manila, we've got to go. It was great having you on. For everybody who's been listening, you've been listening to Manila Chan. She is a veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program, In Question. We'll be back with another hour. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, coming to you live from the divided states of America. It's time for Fault Lines. In the politically independent corner, I am investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host Shane Stranahan, your political analyst Jamarl Thomas.
Together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, quick table of contents for the hour. In our first segment right here, in about 15 minutes, we're interviewing Ted Rall. Then at 9:30, we're going to be talking with John Kiriakou. With Ted Rall, just briefly letting people know with Ted Rall, we're planning on talking about Biden, how he might be a right-wing president. And with John Kiriakou, we're planning on talking more about Portland and Trump's general policies. Trump's authoritarian state is the name of our segment. I don't know if I would frame it that way, but I see what people are going for. In any event, that's what's happening later on in the hour. Right now, though, we have headlines. Top headline today, we were talking about this earlier too, the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives vote to cut the Pentagon's budget by 10% failed. That was overnight. The vote was 93 yay, 324 nay. This is the first time in decades that Congress has considered a substantial cut to a bloated Pentagon budget. Despite the rhetoric, which is always good during a campaign season, the reality is this vote indicates, is both parties are still firmly pro-war. In our next headline, the USA has reported over 1,000 deaths per day for the first time since May. Yesterday afternoon, in his first solo press room briefing on the coronavirus in months, President Trump warned that, quote, it will get worse, end quote. On Sunday, the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, said he may re-implement a stay-at-home order over the next week or two. In our next story, Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the next COVID bill passed by Congress will include more direct payments to individuals and families. The GOP wants to spend about $1 trillion on that bill. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said Monday that the goal was to keep the spending bill around $1 trillion, but by Tuesday he had abandoned that. Democrats had proposed extending $600 a week benefits due to expire at the end of this month until January, while Republicans would rather cut those extra benefits down to about $200 a week. So Democrats are pushing for about $2,400 a month from that. Republicans are pushing for about $800 a week, so a fraction there, about a third exactly. In our next story, 15 people were wounded Tuesday evening outside a funeral in Chicago. Victims there ranged from 21 to 65 years old. This came after inhabitants of a car drove by and started shooting, and then attendees of the funeral began shooting back. I will note the funeral was itself mourning a victim of gun violence. In our next story, Twitter has banned 7,000 QAnon accounts, limited 150,000 others. This is part of a broad crackdown. A Twitter spokesperson said that while the targeted enforcement fell under Twitter's existing platform manipulation rules, its classification of QAnon material and behavior as coordinated harmful activity was a new designation. Last year, the FBI designated QAnon as a potential domestic terrorist threat. The FBI's report on QAnon's ties to dangerous real-world activities led in part to Twitter's decision, a spokesperson said. In Denmark, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is today meeting with the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, who last August called Trump's proposal to buy Greenland absurd. Pompeo is suspected to discuss the coronavirus and China while there, and in addition to meeting with Prime Minister Frederiksen, will also be meeting with the Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs, along with the ministers of Greenland and the Faroe Islands. This signals that the Arctic is a priority for the visit. The United States has ordered the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston in a move the Chinese Foreign Ministry today called, quote, outrageous and unjustified, end quote. State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus said the U.S. was acting to, quote, protect American intellectual property and America's private information, end quote. Pardon? This follows an announcement by the Justice Department on Tuesday of an indictment charging 2 Chinese nationals, both in China, with hacking governments, dissidents, human rights activists, and private companies, including those engaged in COVID-19 vaccine research. China currently has its embassy in Washington and, in addition to Houston, consulates in New York, LA, San Francisco, and Chicago. An article in China's Global Times, an outlet that's close to the ruling Communist Party, suggested that China could order the closure of the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong in response to the State Department's latest decision. In our next story, a hostage standoff aboard a bus in Ukraine ended yesterday shortly after Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky promoted the animal rights film Earthlings on social media. That came at the request of the hostage taker. That was his basically precondition for letting the hostages go. Apparently, the hostage taker, who was a 44-year-old convicted criminal, also liked to take care of stray dogs and was an animal rights activist. In our next story, Russia is reporting that they have developed a working COVID-19 vaccine and will begin mass production next month with the goal of inoculating its population in the autumn. The chief executive of the Russian Direct Investment Fund has said that 50 million Russians, or about a third of the population, could be vaccinated, quote, in the near future, end quote. And in my last story today, Trump was asked at his press conference about Ghislaine Maxwell, and of course is the fixer to apex pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Trump dodged the question, saying he wished her well. Pardon me. Trump and Bill Clinton's relationship with Epstein and Maxwell is well established in photographic record and by their own statements, even though neither of the men have been willing to divulge details of that relationship. That's the news. You've listened to headlines here. Hopefully you're still listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And like I said earlier, we're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. Again, the number there is 202-521-1320. And Jamarl, I'm going to pass it over to you for a second. I'm sure you know the feeling. I need to cough, man. Could you please take over for a second?
You're fine. It's on the radio and everything is live. You're good. I want to kind of slide back into the conversation that we were having with Milichan, and I think we've had this conversation before about the protests. I'm often enraptured, to the chagrin of my wife, who gets annoyed by it, with words and the meaning for those words, and how there is no meaning for those words, even though people ascribe meaning. Whether we're talking about things like good, bad, justice, hope, or justification being one of those words. In fact, as point of fact, without there being an absolute justification for anything is within the eye of the beholder. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And oftentimes people don't entirely, at the very least, get the rational actions of a person who other people say that what they're doing is unjust. Now, I understand that destroying, let's say, and going into a building and destroying that building, and that guy had nothing to do. That guy was only barely making ends meet, just like the person who destroyed that building did so, meaning that person might have had horrible intent, even though the overwhelming majority of the people who are out there protesting were doing so for for good ends and good reasons. But let's be very clear, though. That guy who destroyed that property didn't come out of a vacuum. We must, as a society, recommend with what we put out into the universe. God is the end result of that. And at the end of the day, when you are doing things as society that some people allow, whether or not the people have direct control over it or not is irrelevant. What you see in your world is the outcome of everything that was put into your world and the way that that world is propagated and the conditions to which you allow those people to persist in. And it's just an unfortunate reality that oftentimes the outcome of those things hurt the very people who were already hurting. It's not that I like it. It's not that I love it. I understand that making this argument and taking the perspective of this way is somewhat difficult in the context of talking about it. But I am right that the only reason that those things happen in real terms is because you had a society that proliferated a situation where those things will happen. For example, if I make the case and say how many people die every year through poverty, that number is high. That number is tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. If I say, is it true that people who are in poverty experience more violence statistically, the answer is yes. If I say they're the purveyors of it also, is that answer is also yes. But in both situations, that answer is yes. Either it's dispensing violence or, for that matter, encountering that violence. If I point out that single mothers and the fertility or childhood mortality rates are higher, dramatically so, for a certain segment of the population, that's true. So, even when I make the point about brain development and say, look, sometimes that's a factor of poverty where that's one of those things where we can see it, not just statistically, materially, in our kids. I'm making the very basic point that there's a lot of aspects of violence that are just invisible. And sometimes those things are visited upon a society that has ignored and isolated those things in ways that the people who weren't necessarily entirely paying attention to it don't like. But part and parcel to this notion of protest is I am going to make my pain that I experience invisible and silent on you. And even in people who are doing things that are utterly horrific, they're doing those things utterly horrific to some degree because it was etched on them in the society that they came from. Look, I don't need to come up with a justification for the reason people do things in regards to these protests. That justification is their own. And they come into it rational, even if deplorable reasons. It is what it is in the case of a society working itself out. I don't wring my hands over it. I look at it as your society is exhibiting behavior that is utterly atrocious because your society has done things over the course of the lifetime that has been utterly atrocious. And there's been a segment of it that has taken a hit when other segment has not. We do have a caller, Connie from Texas. Connie, what's going on?
It's Connie. I used to call in often when Lee and Garland and Lee, but I still listen to the show every once in a while. Glad to be calling in and talking to you guys today. I wanted to let you know, because you were talking about Pompeo in the news segment. Do you know Bill Binney? Because he's been on your show, I think, a while back. He's very famous. Anyway, he's having a press conference tomorrow. I thought your listeners might be interested. The LaRouche organization, the Schiller Institute. Bill Binney is having a press conference titled "Neither Flynn nor Stone were guilty because there was no Russian hack." And he actually met with Pompeo in October of 2017 when Pompeo was CIA director, telling him that he knows that there was no Russian hack of the 2016 election. And he's going to tell us what Pompeo actually said to him, because Pompeo never sent that information to any of the intelligence community or even to the president himself. And now the same intelligence community is saying Boris Johnson wants to pressure Boris Johnson and the British for Russia hacking their election. So this whole Russia thing is going to be is got to be put to rest. And I think your listeners and other people might be interested. And you can ask a question. I can send you guys a link, or I can send it to you or Shane if you want to. They're asking journalists who would like to ask questions about Binney in his work that he's done over many years in helping America.
Very cool.
Thank you for that, Connie. Thanks for the tip there. I was just checking that out. I was looking at that. Hadn't heard of that in advance of what you were just saying here. It's happening tomorrow. This is going to be at 11 a.m. Eastern, and you're right. It's going to be online. and I'm going to RSVP for it. I'll think about some questions, might send those in, but regardless, interested in checking that out. So thanks for the tip there. Appreciate that. With that, there's a bunch of stuff I kind of want to say in response to what you were saying, Jamarl.
Go for it.
I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this thing where I talk a bunch and then we push into Dead Raw segment. That wouldn't be fair to him. So I'm going to go out pretty early here. We'll be back in a minute. We're talking with Ted Rawl about Biden, about Joseph Biden, whether or not he's going to be a right-wing president based on his right-wing record. This is a story over on Ted Rawl's website, rawl.com. You can check that out while we're going into the break. We'll be back with Ted Rawl in just a minute. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day. There. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a regular segment called Criminal Injustice about the most egregious conduct of our courts and how justice is denied to so many people in this country. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Thursday and every Thursday for thorough and independent analysis of our criminal injustice system.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. A quick note for folks who are listening in. If you're listening in and you want to listen to us elsewhere, if you're listening in online and you're in D.C. or Kansas City, you can listen to us on the radio in those cities and in their wider metropolitan areas. In D.C., we're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM, whereas in Kansas City, we're on 102.9 and 104.7 FM. Both of those are FM stations. We're also on over in Kansas City on 1140 AM. If you want to catch us online, you can. We're on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Spotify. Those are the audio broadcasts. We're also on video live right now on YouTube. Just do a quick search on YouTube for Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. We're also over live on Twitter, twitter.com/faultlinesradio. You'll see us live there with our Periscope feed right up top. One quick note. I realize that I don't usually throw this one out there. We're also live over on Facebook. If you do a search for the Sputnik News Facebook channel, you can catch us there. So I closed the last segment out early thinking that we'd have Ted Rawl on in time. We would have been starting the segment right on time. That's contrary to our usual standard. I usually push things a little bit far, but you know what? I'm just going to go back to it. You were saying some stuff before we took Connie's call about this issue of justification that I'd sort of opened up. We'd gotten near the territory, but then I focused the conversation on this issue of justification. In our last segment with Manila Chan back at 8:45 to about 9 o'clock, we were talking about this. Here's why I think it matters. You and I are on the radio. She's a TV host. We are public figures to whatever sense that makes sense to say we are. We have those things. And in addition to getting the facts out, which I hope we do better than other networks just by virtue of trying harder, hopefully, I hope we do a good job at that thing. In addition to that, we also have our opinions. We talk about our opinions, etc. And we have a lot of opinions about what the president does, about our foreign policy, about what other countries are doing. I think it's just as fair for us to have opinions about what people in our country are doing. Especially if you're on the same side of the aisle as them. If you're a left winger and you're criticizing right wingers, that's pretty damn easy to do. It just consolidates your local group identity, and it puts you in a position where the people around you look up to you, and the people on the other side frown at you like you're used to them doing. The same thing if you're on the right and you're criticizing the people on the left. It's a lot harder to criticize people on your side, but in the end, that's I think the only sort of self-repair mechanism you can have is if you're in an organization or if you're in a community and you see things going wrong or you see people acting immaturely, you want to make some effort at least to talk with them. Now, there's an extreme of that, which is everybody going in lockstep because there's some sort of top-down command and control hierarchy that either culturally or through some institutions gets enacted within that group. That's another thing. Anyway, this is all sort of philosophical and abstract. I think it's completely justified for us to judge negatively and or positively different actions that the protesters are doing. And when we ask whether it's justified, we're not necessarily asking, do they think it's justified? Because of course they do. That's why they're doing it. We're asking, do we think it's justified? And I think that's especially important because we as a society are trying to form opinions about the protests and what they're doing, what the right response to those protests should be. In other words, it's central for us to have this conversation about justification, because otherwise we're not actually talking about morality. We're not talking about what people should be doing or what's right. Now, your response may be, and I'm not going to try to step in too far ahead of you. You can say whatever you want to. Your response may be, morality is ultimately subjective. It's up to each of us. We all have our opinions, and at the end of the day, we sort of have to just come together with our own perspectives and then make sense of that. To that imagined straw man response, I agree, but then I'd go one step further and say, yes, we need to come in, we need to have that conversation, and I want to have that conversation, and that's exactly what I'm doing, is trying to have that conversation about ethics. What's your take on that, Jamarl?
So I can't say I hate your response. I would say this. I agree with you, right? That basically everybody is going to come away with their own particular point of view about this stuff, and that we as people, whatever we are, have to come up with some idea of whether something is right or wrong from our own standard and framing of the world. Granted, agree, totally agree. And when we're looking at rioters, also we have to do the same. I would take point of thing that rioters are not on my side of the political spectrum per se. I don't necessarily know what those people are out there doing, but I would not be out there doing it, left to my own devices. So there's that part. But everything else you said, I agree with. Ted, it sounds like Ted's here.
Ted is on. That was a wonderful introduction. We have Ted Rall on. I'm excited. We were looking forward to having you on. I'm going to give you your brief intro, Ted. You're already here. You kind of crashed the party like we wanted you to. I don't mean to make too much of that little phrase there. Ted Rall, for everybody who's been listening, is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted is great. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall, TEDRALL. You can also check out his website, rall.com. I don't mean to make too much of a point of it, Ted. That is just the best domain name ever. You lucky son of a gun. You got that guy. In any event, Ted, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Did we lose him?
Hello?
Oh, there you are. Ted, can you hear us?
I see him muted. I see he is muted. Please, Ted, unmute yourself.
There I am.
There we are.
There I am. Okay, yes. Technology is
welcome
so
to the
awesome.
show.
Yeah.
It's
fun.
fun.
That's how I'm doing.
Good to hear. One of those mornings, eh?
Yeah, totally. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Hey, yeah, no, it's great to have you. All right, so here's what we brought you on officially. We're running slightly short on time, so I'll just get straight into the meat of the matter. We're talking about this article over on your website. You wrote, title of which is, "Like Trump, Biden would be a right-wing president." That's the title. You're talking about his history. I'm going to start like this. Why do you think Biden would be a right-wing president? What are you looking at in his history, his policies, his recommendations, his role as the VP, his long tenure in Congress? What would you say makes him a right-wing president like Trump?
Well, in particular, foreign policy. On foreign policy, he's actually to the right of Donald Trump. Trump's had a skepticism of foreign interventionism that we've seen for a long time. And most notably, and he's really not getting much credit for this, he was the first president to talk to the Taliban, sign a peace deal, and he's actually wants to pull our troops out before the deadline that was set by the peace accord in Doha. Meanwhile, you've got a bunch of neoconservatives like Liz Cheney who are aligned with House Democrats to deny funding for the removal of troops from Afghanistan. It's hilarious that they have to allocate funds to take troops out, but they do. And so Trump has 8,000 troops there that he would like to bring home but cannot. Biden's on that side. He was in the room, although he says that he disapproved, but there's no record of that. He was in the room when the Obama administration effectively destroyed Syria and Libya. He voted for the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. If you look at domestic policy, obviously there's the crime bill. There's sort of that whole Nixon goes to China thing, but from the other way around, whereby Biden was a guy who wrote the USA Patriot Act. He helped push Obamacare, which was originally a Heritage Foundation idea. And it goes on and on and on. And there's a couple of exceptions, most notably his opposition to the 1990 Gulf War. But for the most part, this is a 44-year record of conservatism. And if this were the 1950s or 1960s, he would have fit in quite comfortably into the mainstream of the Republican Party. And that's what we should be looking at. We should be looking at what this guy's track record. And I think it's also notable that he's never expressed any regret or apologized for these previous moves. as I always tell liberals, why would you forgive someone who's not asking for forgiveness? But Joe Biden has never apologized for the invasion of Iraq. He blames the Bush administration for the lies about WMDs, which, frankly, millions of protesters all over the country knew were lies at the time. And so he's basically telling us that he's either lying or he was an idiot. And either way, why should this guy be president?
You know, I think there's also something to be said about the position that Joe Biden is taking right now, where he's unaccountable because of who his opposition is. Meaning, Joe Biden, not only does he not have to ask for forgiveness, basically he's standing there as if I'm your last chance to hold back the apocalypse, and I don't necessarily care what you want in regards to policy. I am just going to be here just because I'm here. Like, it's an unaccountability thing. It's you have nowhere else to go, distilled into its most, horrendous aspects. How does a public get a politician to do pretty much anything when basically they are throwing themselves at that politician just because of who he's not versus who he is? Meaning 70% of the people voting for Biden are doing so entirely because he's not Donald Trump. That is a horrible position for a public to be in. How could they ever get anything accomplished like that?
Well, there's the two-party trap is sort of a political Sophie's choice, right? Where you're being asked to play some sadist's sick game and for their enjoyment. And the answer to that is kind of like, for another movie analogy, it's like war games you don't play. So Jean-Paul Sartre had this great essay where he talked about a classic existential dilemma. I put a gun in your head and I tell you, shoot this other person. If you don't, I'm going to shoot you. And everyone says, well, the right answer is you shoot the other person. No, the right answer is you say, go to hell, Ted. You can shoot me if you want, but I'm not going to shoot someone for your enjoyment. In this situation, the right move, both morally and tactically for progressives and left-leaning Democrats, is to not vote at all or to vote third party. And here's why.
Exactly.
You can look at 2016 and see that in 2016 was the first time in 40 or 50 years that progressive voters, Bernie Sanders Democrats in the primaries, did not show up in large numbers to vote for the Democrat in the general election. And that had a tremendous effect. For the first time in 40 years, suddenly even mainstream corporate Democrats like Kamala Harris and Cory Booker endorsed Bernie Sanders' ideas like Medicare for all and $15 minimum wage and student loan forgiveness. That would not have happened if left-leaning voters had not withheld their votes in the general election. If you give away your votes without getting anything back in return, you're not going to be able to extract any concessions. And this is the most basic aspect of exercising political power as a citizen. A citizen's vote is not really worth much. It's only worth something if you can withhold it, in the same way that a worker who feels mistreated can withhold his or her labor in order to get more to be treated better and be paid better.
That's right. So true. I mean, but you know what they're going to say, right? They're going to say, oh, you're just trying to help to get Trump elected. That's what they're going to say. But it misses the point that you're making, that, look, if you have things that you want to accomplish, the only way to accomplish those things in a political sense is not participating. Otherwise, you're just going to incentivize being taken advantage of with a vote that becomes meaningless. Go for it, Shane.
I feel like here's the thing. I feel like we might need some better terminology for these things than left versus right, because it gets confused. I'll lay out what I'm guessing your guys' take is on this, and then I'll say my take, and then you can come back at me. I'm guessing you think that there's the real left, which is the community of leftists, progressives, not exactly liberals, but there's, a continuum of sort of political ideas that includes liberalism. And it seems like the establishment Democrats are quote unquote liberals. They're not exactly on the left. They're sort of center left or maybe even right wing in a lot of these cases. My problem with that is it's massively confusing. We say left wing and right wing in this country, and we broadly are referring to Democrats and Republicans. But as we've seen, the Democrats have become the war party over the last couple of years. It was Trump that was wanting to pull back overseas. It was at every step the Democrats that were wanting to push back. So I understand there's this sort of split dichotomy that we're operating within, one that refers to official party politics, the other refers to unofficial mass politics. I get that. But isn't it just confusing? Can't we get somewhere better, like some better plateau or valley of humane, peaceful political representation where the terms we're using just make sense. Because again, it's the Democrats that are the pro-war party now, and they're left, quote unquote left, maybe, but they're left. What's your take on that, Ted?
Well, we definitely need better vocabulary for political parties and orientations. But I think the confusion is going to stay with us for the foreseeable future, because it's in the interest of the powers that be and in the interest of some political movements, including some good ones, to sow a little bit of confusion in order to try to demonize their opponents and bring in new allies that might be unexpected otherwise. So I don't think that's going to change. I think, the ground is going to keep shifting, and people are just going to have to remain alert. It's a lot like living in the Soviet Union and trying to read between the lines of, of state media to see, where things really are. And that's what American media has come to. And that's how, and certainly the political, the two major parties are playing it that way as well. I think that, I think there is, getting back to the whole two-party trap, though, there is a question of, is Donald Trump such an existential emergency, such an existential threat to the American system and to democracy? And is he such a fascist threat that it justifies voting for Joe Biden no matter what? And I think that's something that is fair to talk about and discuss. But I also think that what it's omitting is the fact that Biden is probably going to be dangerous in ways that Democrats are not considering, and that a Donald Trump second term, far from being this terrible, ominous threat, is more likely going to be characterized by scandal and incompetence. And that's because that's what second terms are usually for. Reagan had Iran-Contra, Clinton had Monica Lewinsky, Obama sort of just didn't have anything going on in his second term. You show me a second-term president, and I'll show you a president who wasn't getting anything done. And that even includes FDR. The second term was about Supreme Court stacking, and that was a fiasco.
That's interesting. That's an interesting perspective. I kind of want to come back to that, but we've got to close this out. Ted, thank you for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't get more time, but really appreciate you stepping in. And with that, we're out. You've been listening to the voice of Ted Rall. He is a political cartoonist and a syndicated columnist. You've been listening to Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute with John Kiriakou.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my disembodied co-host, Shane Stranahan. He's the floating head right here. We are coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. You can catch us on radio there at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, give us a like, share the video. You can also join in on the conversation by sending us a chat, a tweet, or reaching us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Joining us for this segment is one of my favorite people to interview, former CIA office co-host of Loud and Clear, author of the books including The CIA Insider's Guide to Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. We're joined by John Kiriakou. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jamarl.
Absolutely. So we brought you on to have a conversation about the unidentified troops that are in Portland. With your experience, we thought that you may be able to share, I guess, some insight on this from maybe inside intelligence in the way it looks at this. So basically, as you know, troops, unidentified, were riding around in black vans, apprehending people in Portland. They were unidentified. People didn't know who they were. The government, meaning the mayor and the governor, gave, at the very least outwardly, statements of disapproval, saying they didn't necessarily want this. You have lawsuits that are being filed. And you even have, I think, DHS saying that wondering if this makes them look bad from the standpoint of the public. Can you share a little light on the mindset and the thinking of this, and even the response and the consequences of this, and how this looks going forward, where Trump is basically saying, yeah, I'm going to expand this across the United States?
You bet. First, I want to say how unusual this is, how rare this is. It reminds me very much of what we saw in the streets of Chicago in the summer of 1968. That's how rare and unusual it is. What we don't normally see, Jamarl, is a president calling out federal, I'm not going to call them troops because they're not. They're agents. This morning, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper said that he was worried that Americans would think that these were military personnel because they're dressed as military personnel. They're not. The best that we can tell is that they're agents of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, or CBP, Customs and Border Protection. I've read also that there are some officers from the Bureau of Prisons, but they're wearing fatigues. They do not have name tags. They're not identifying themselves. They're not reading anybody Miranda rights. They're renting their vans that they're using to essentially kidnap people from Enterprise Rent-A-Car, we learned yesterday. And a friend of mine who was snatched up in Portland by one of these gangs of federal agents said that as soon as he began to protest that he had constitutional rights and wanted to speak to an attorney, they pulled him over and threw him out of the van. So I think that this whole thing is a plan by Donald Trump to frighten and to intimidate. And instead, it's having the opposite effect, where now people across the country are going to Portland and going to Chicago to keep up the protest.
John, this is Shane here. Great to hear your voice. Last we spoke, just glad to hear you again. Quick question about this stuff. I'm looking at this and I have a lot of mixed feelings about both sides of this. I've condemned the protesters for doing some of the rioting stuff, and then we've been talking about the unmarked vans, the unmarked federal officials coming in, again, using fatigues that look pretty similar to Army fatigues, coming in to arrest people. That's not good, just to put it in the simplest and euphemistic terms. It does remind me of like the SS, the Gestapo, some of those tactics, some of these more Nazi tactics, or the Soviet Union, again, secret police, this idea that's within this last century, the sort of frame of mind that seeing this stuff puts me in. But on the other hand, I feel like there's something I might be missing. But just handing it straight over to you, what's your take on that parallel, that comparison?
I don't think you're missing anything. I think that the purpose of these agents is to intimidate, nothing more. I don't think that they're going to build cases against people to go into federal court and charge people with crimes. I think it's just to frighten and to get people to be so afraid of being scooped up by these secret police that they just stop protesting. I agree with you, Shane. You know, burning places down, looting, that's all bad. It gives the entire movement a bad name. But this kind of thing is unprecedented. Whether Donald Trump likes it or not, people have constitutional rights. And you have a right to know why you're being arrested. You have a right to march in the streets and to seek redress of grievances. And protesters, a lot of protesters aren't being able to exercise those rights. We saw this viral video from last week, for example, of a Navy veteran and graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, a man in his mid-50s, just standing in the seat. Standing there. He wasn't breaking the law. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there. And two of these agents beat him and broke his hand. That's what people are facing in Portland. That's what they're going to begin facing in Chicago and apparently elsewhere. But I'll tell you, with the law on the side of the protesters, I don't think this ends well for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump is going to have bad ends on this. Because basically, I don't think the public is buying his side of this argument. The notion of, I'm just going to reopen the economy, I'm going to throw these kids back to school, and I am going to cobble together a group of goons of sorts and have these guys rolling around through the streets of America under my discretion, almost under my direct command, that seems to not go over well, and that seems, for a population, it's going to respond to that. It would be weird if a population didn't respond to that. That level of escalation of violence against human beings. I mean, I think that's all that violence is. It can only be against human beings. But beyond that particular point, and specifically, I guess, on that point, if my thought was maybe that's something that he actually wants. I mean, if you're a president and you're running against your opponents and you're basically making a law and order argument, and that law and order argument to some degree needs some level of substantiation, and part and parcel to one of the ways of getting that is to get more people on the streets, which is counterintuitive in a way, especially when the majority of the population seems to go with the argument that, yeah, Trump screwed up, and we agree with the basis of the protests. But in this situation, if you're going with that angle of law and order, maybe it helps to have more people in the streets. And maybe it doesn't necessarily hurt your campaign by saying this country is unruly and we need law and order in this country by basically taking an action that is a direct provocation of the public itself that is known and understood that was going to take place. What do you think about that?
I mean,
go for it. I hope I'm explaining it correctly.
You have, and I think that there's something to it, something to what you're saying. Donald Trump has a habit of trying to appeal to his base. He doesn't reach out to those in the center. He doesn't reach out to independents because he doesn't think that he has to politically. We know that he dislikes Chicago. He's complained about Chicago all through his presidency. He's complained about the elected leadership in Chicago. And last weekend, 72 people were shot and 19 people were killed in violence in Chicago. So, I mean, what a great entree for Donald Trump to exercise this law and order policy that he's so proud of. And it might be that he does want people to complain. He does want people to be afraid because his base loves it. But the polls are showing that these repeated entreaties to invade don't do anything to raise his poll numbers. He just keeps on sinking. And I'll add one other thing that I got from realclearpolitics.com, and that is that Hillary Clinton never had the numbers that Joe Biden currently has in the battleground states. Hillary Clinton never had the numbers that Joe Biden now has among suburban voters. And I think that's what Donald Trump should be focused on, is attracting those swing voters in swing states rather than fighting with the mayor of Chicago and sending agents to Chicago to fight in the streets.
So on Monday, a couple of days ago, we had Caleb Maupin on the show. He was on at 9:30 Eastern on Monday, and we were talking about the protests in Portland, but specifically, we were also talking about this issue of federal officials, unmarked officials coming in, abducting people. That's just the word I'll use. Abducting people who, as far as I can tell, looking at it from the videos, hadn't been doing anything immediately wrong. They were just sort of walking around on the streets. I did see people wearing face masks, but that alone isn't cause for them to be abducted. Anyway, we were talking with him about this issue, and towards the tail end, he said that there was sort of one break. This gave us one big opportunity, which is a conversation is happening right now around the issue of unprecedented use of force. And on this issue in the United States, there's a long history, both within the country and outside of the country, enacted on foreign powers, of the unprecedented use of force, of unjustified use of force by federal officials, whether it's the Army or whether it's suppressing historic forms of dissent in the U.S. So I'm gonna hand it over to you. I see that opportunity too, but what would you, if you were to look into the historical record and you wanted to bring some things to light using this conversation to try to widen the conversation so we can actually have one about this issue in a more general sense, what are some of the historical instances that you might look at? We're going into a break, so if you want to, we can do this now, or we can do it on the other side of the break, whatever your opinion is, whatever your take is.
No, I can do it quickly. I started off this segment by talking about Chicago in 1968, the summer of 68, the Democratic Convention. I think we're seeing the same kind of thing, where Senator Abraham Ribicoff criticized Mayor Daley of Chicago and said that we were seeing Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. I think that's what we're seeing here. These are very simply secret police that are not out to arrest people; they're out to intimidate them.
That's the voice of John Kiriakou. We're going to continue this conversation with John in just a minute. Until then, please know you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute with John Kiriakou.
Fault Lines.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're joined in the last segment. We continue to be joined in this segment by John Kiriakou, former CIA officer and current co-host of Loud and Clear, also on Radio Sputnik. He's also the author of a few books, including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. So, John, we're continuing this conversation we started last segment about what's going on in Portland and more broadly the issue of force, the issue of, again, sort of unprecedented. It has precedents. You're just talking about in Chicago back in the 60s, there are some precedents. I shouldn't be using that phrase. It does seem like it might be happening on a larger scale at this point, but that's kind of where I want to turn. Title of our second segment is Trump's Authoritarian State. I want to have a conversation about that. It seems to me like he is in a slightly weird position here, in a bunch of ways. That's an understatement. He's in a weird position here. You have in these cities acts of, I'll use the term force, but some people would use the term violence, against in some cases people, but in most cases property, whether that's people tearing down statues, or whether it's people burning down buildings, there's the use of force and violence on multiple levels. And as far as I can tell, mayors in those cities have been relatively permissive. This comes after, again, the police's credibility is tarnished. This whole wave of protests and, more broadly, the Black Lives Matter movement is in some sense a conflict between Black Americans and this issue of oppressive use of police force. That also has to take place, like we've been trying to have this conversation, it has to take place within a wider conversation about the history of economics, the history of a lot of the issues, obviously relating to slavery and their legacy in America. We're having that conversation, but specifically, again, the sort of proximate argument is about police and policing. And what's happened, as far as I can tell, is after this argument got started, a lot more attention was put on the use of violence by police, and a lot of police sort of pulled back locally. And so in Seattle, in Portland, in Seattle, you saw the creation of the Chaz. In Portland, you see some uses of police violence, but you also see this protest continuing for almost 2 months at this point, almost exactly a 2-month period. We're now on, I think, the 54th, maybe now the 55th consecutive day of protests. Maybe today would be the 55th. My point is that was happening on the local level. And then he started to call in the National Guard, these other federal force agencies to come in to the local level. That is put. I understand. This is a little bit of a weird thing to say. I can understand why he did that, but from the optical perspective and from what's actually going down on the ground, I'm going to criticize that pretty roundly. Here's where I'm going. with the title of with the title of the segment being about the sort of future of this authoritarian state, where we're going to see that going, I don't see that problem getting any less. If anything, I see this issue of local violence being criticized and then federal violence being called down to sort of do the work. That just seems like it's going to keep on going on. We're going to have more of these conversations. What's your take on that issue, John?
I think we will have more of this so long as Donald Trump is president. Donald Trump, I think, is enjoying himself through this. I think that he enjoys intimidating other elected officials. I think he enjoys intimidating the left. And I think that he's genuinely angry when he sees protesters pulling down statues or defacing monuments or what have you. I don't think he's making any of that up. It really bothers him. And frankly, I think that he thinks it makes him look weak. And so as long as Donald Trump is president, I think we'll see more of it. Let me tell you one other thing, too. When the demonstrations first began, I was driving back from New York City, and I came into Washington, and I needed to stop on Capitol Hill to see a friend of mine. So I parked in a neighborhood about 4 blocks from the Capitol building. And just as I was parking, a van pulled up, an unmarked van, and about a dozen men got out of it. And they were all dressed identically. They had black polo shirts on, and they had khakis. But they were tactical khakis with all of the different pockets. And you could see that they had handcuffs. Each one of them had handcuffs in his pocket. And they were talking about where each of them was going to go around the city, not the whole city, but the area where the demonstrations were taking place, to infiltrate the crowds. So this isn't something new. This isn't something that we're just now seeing for the first time in Portland. It's certainly bigger and I think more heavy-handed. But this is something that the Trump administration has been doing since these demonstrations began.
I'm curious, from your standpoint, from your point of view, with all of the killings that took place in Chicago last week, you mentioned how basically the troops, basically, we can't even call them troops per se, but officials or a cadre of people that Donald Trump have pulled together in order to be his own police force that was roaming the streets in Chicago. Roaming the streets of protests in Portland. Should Donald Trump, in earnest, send in official channels, not necessarily in this kind of black-footed way, but should you send in, and should the president care about that much killing taking place on the streets of Chicago? And I mean this earnestly, not in the political grand scheming things, but and maybe even in the sense of a political grand scheme of things. But with that many people that have lost their lives over that small period of time in Chicago, and for whatever other state, and there's more that goes into this, of course. I mean, because the moment that you justify sending in troops to deal with any kind of violence in Chicago, or in that case, you also have to deal with, well, why is that violence there? And if I care so much about the violence being ended in the first place, I have to deal with the primary causes of it, not just the end result of it. Those type of things, which is why I don't think this will ever happen. But can an argument be made that with that many deaths on the streets, that I, as president, can't allow a city to devolve into this level of violence, considering that there are other people who live there that are not participant in these games of whatever that's taking place that's getting these people killed?
Yeah, if you were the president, if I were the president, I would be very concerned about violence in Chicago. And the way I would try to attack that violence would not be with the use of these unknown federal agents. It would be economic development. It would be education. It would be job training programs. That's how you bring people out of poverty. Poverty and unemployment lead to crime and lead to a whole bunch of societal issues. This is a proven fact. It's been studied for many decades. So you don't send troops to just crack heads. You send block grants and you institute programs to lift people out of poverty. That's what works.
On top of that part, and I agree with you on that wholeheartedly, it doesn't necessarily seem to be a government thing. It's when it gets to issues of cash, it's like my thought when all of this first started, going back months ago, I said that defund the police was too diminutive for what you're trying to accomplish. Meaning for all of these people, because if you remember when this started, you had people in Germany, in Britain, in Australia, in New Zealand, like these massive, massive, massive protests, all backing and supporting this kind of thing of, look, America needs to change. The wild part about it, though, is defund the police seemed so diminutive in comparison to the number of people that were out there marching. And I kept making the point that the issue is poverty. Deal with the poverty. The other stuff will go in line. Meaning, if you want to defund the police, you got to do it organically. You have to get rid of the reason or the logic that the cops are there in the first place. This notion that you're going to, give money to poor people to police other poor people because you don't want to deal with the fact that they're poor. And it's cheaper in the sense of economic sense for the people who are at the top to do it that way, as opposed to dealing with the real material ends of the population. I made the point, you got to deal with poverty. Dealing with the thing of defund the police slightly and somewhat misses the point. But people push the defund the police thing. So this is where we are. In pushing the defund the police thing and trying to kind of get to the point that, look, the point is poverty, the point is poverty. We miss the boat on this, right? I mean, basically, we miss how there's that skew is there statistically that you can really get rid of poverty dealing with this. And this movement doesn't necessarily seem to have taken a strident political interest in addressing that outside of just the framework of defund the police and that being the tap phrase. Am I missing something on this in the way I'm describing this?
No, I think you've hit it on the head. And I think defund the police is the wrong slogan. I think it should be demilitarize the police. Defunding the police has actually worked a couple of times. It worked in Trenton, New Jersey. It worked in Compton in Los Angeles, where those police departments were so rife with corruption that they were unworkable, and they were defunded and absorbed by the county sheriff's office. That worked. But nationwide, a clear majority of Americans from both major parties opposes an effort to defund the police. I think demilitarization is more important. There's no reason for the police to have tanks. There's no reason for the police to have armored personnel carriers or to have 50 caliber machine guns. These are just instruments of destruction and of death. So the police don't need those kinds of things. But yeah, I think you're right. We got sidetracked by arguing about the philosophy of defunding the police rather than about the root causes of the problems that lead us to the conclusion that the police should be defunded. And again, that is poverty and unemployment. And that's what we should be focusing on.
Politically, I kept saying the Democrats are going to focus entirely on the issue of cops. I said this going back months ago. I said from the standpoint of I said they were never going to deal with poverty. They're never going to touch it. And you give them out by saying defund the police because you allow the entire topic and the focus of it to be on cops. Now, those cops, whatever those cops are basically being asked to do something that is infinitely impossible to do. Meaning, if you have an issue that is a root cause in poverty, then the cops are really only ever dealing with the end result of that. They're not dealing with the intrinsic stuff that goes into making this and that a crime. Not to mention, to have a society that is so criminalized where you end up with 25% of the world's population in your jails. We only make up, 4% of the world. So those things can never, ever, ever be addressed from the level of cops. And yet, that's where the money goes. And if Democrats are going to have to deal with this issue because Republicans aren't, you let them off the hook by defund the police. And that's exactly what they did. They turned around and said, oh, we got to do something about these cops. And they screamed to the high hill about the cops. And their bill, instead of dealing with issues of poverty, it goes and says we're just going to focus on the entire issue on cops because it allows them to constrain and talk about it in a way that doesn't adversely affect any of their donors, but their political philosophy in regards to income inequality, meaning to basically not really do anything real about it. When you are working in the services that you're working in, meaning from the standpoint of intelligence, how would you go about getting this done? And I know this is massively weird. As a spy. Meaning, if you had to form a political philosophy in the sense of, okay, I need to get XYZ accomplished, and I know many of these people are going against me on it. How do you do it? How do you get something that is rational as can be through people who have their own rationality regarding to the things that they want to get accomplished that just so happen to conflict to what's in public best interest.
Well, if you're an intelligence officer, frankly, you wouldn't even give it any thought, because that's not your mandate. If you're a CIA officer, your job is very simply to recruit spies to steal secrets overseas, so that your analysts can analyze the information and make policy recommendations to the policymakers in Washington. So if you're a CIA officer, you're not going to pay any attention to this at all. If you're an FBI officer or FBI agent, on the other hand, yeah, you're going to live that question every single day. But you've got this institutionalized bias that automatically puts you on the side of those heavy-handed agents. So if you're in the FBI and your duty when you go out on the street is to introduce yourself as an FBI agent, as federal law enforcement, yeah, you have kind of an uneasy feeling in your stomach working alongside these guys who are probably ICE, probably CBP, probably Bureau of Prisons. You don't like the fact that they're essentially secret troops, but you're not going to do anything about it.
John, thank you for joining us. Appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thanks.
That is the voice of John Kiriakou. He's a former CIA officer, also the co-host of Loud and Clear on Radio Sputnik. Great show today. For everybody who's been listening, at 9:30, like you heard, we talked with John Kiriakou. At 9:15, we spoke with Ted Rall about Biden. At 8:30, we spoke about Portland's protests with Manila Chan. And at 7:30, we talked to Dr. Mikhail Kogan about COVID. Going back. We'll be back tomorrow. You've been listening to the most disruptive show in American news, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, as always, I appreciate you guys joining me. I plan on doing a few more shows before I finish for today. I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe. I have a doctor's appointment later this evening. Guys, you haven't seen me for contributor appreciation, not because I haven't necessarily wanted to do the show. My wife's time scale has changed, and my own time scale has changed just from a illness standpoint that I need to kind of remedy. But it will be back. Trust me. We will be trying to get it done sooner rather than later. So I'll leave it here. I'll probably make a note of that in my other video just so people will know what's going on with that. And I'll say like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.